Hi everybody, thanks very much for joining me early. We'll get started in about 3 minutes. There are some reasons. You don't just have to take my word for anything I'm presenting to you, and I will almost always try to present my sources. And also, if it's a subject that interests you, you can take it away as reading for down the road. So just to set out how we're going to run through tonight's events, I'm going to do an update on some resources, some good examples of OSINT from the last week for about the next 10 to 15 minutes. Then we've been joined by an excellent guest tonight, John Conrad, who is going to run us through some background on the status of shipbuilding capacity in the United States, its implications, some of the conflicts there. I think that'll be a terrific conversation. And then tonight, I wanted to introduce in the space the concept of ham radio and some of its uses for open source work. It's a discussion that some of us have been having on spaces, but sort of outside my format. And I just wanted to bring it up here because I think that either a lot of our listeners are already amateur radio operators or might have been interested in it at some point. And just to get an introduction going and hopefully maybe build up some groups, in this community who are interested in amateur radio. Then, of course, we're going to go to updates from the news in Ukraine. There's been quite a lot of news, even just since last Sunday, and that'll probably be about the second half of the show. And of course, at any point, we do when I'm chatting with John, we'll keep it a sort of interview format for the first little while. But other than that, throughout the show, we do invite participation. And so if you'd like to come up either with a comment or a question, you can always request the microphone button. It's in the bottom left corner of the Spaces window. And before I get started, we do want to get as many people into the conversation as possible. So if you would retweet the space, I'd appreciate it. That button is in the bottom right-hand corner of the window. And I don't think it's available yet, but for most of our spaces, friends of the space do stream our audio onto YouTube along with some background graphics. We'll put a link to that up in the nest once the link to the live stream is available. I would encourage you to participate here whenever you can so that you can get into the conversation in that you cannot speak through YouTube, but you can hear. However, if you ever want to look back at a matter or if you miss a discussion, then you can have a look at the YouTube channel to catch up. And just a reminder that if you have a look at the tweet that is the furthest right in the nest, that's I call it my agenda. It starts with the invitation to the space, but if you scroll down, it essentially has my speaking notes. And in that way, you can look ahead a little bit and, some issues might catch your attention and you can develop questions or comments. So just running through resources for maybe about 10 minutes. As always, there is the community calendar. It's the second item from the right. We've just begun a new month, so the graphic there for it looks a little bit bare. But if you scroll back, there are often 2 or 3 events per day. This is both spaces, so it's sort of friends of the space who enjoy hosting, whether it be on Ukraine or OSINT. Those spaces go on the calendar. In addition, we put on events that are hosted by outside entities, think tanks, universities, and the like. Usually it's either a registration link for an upcoming event or it's a recording if the event's already happened. So the 2 events that I included to highlight today, there is an upcoming discussion by CSIS on May the 10th. And the subject is a contested domain from space theory to practice. And I thought that one might be interesting to the crowd tonight because a lot of that relies on radio communication. And even though we're not going to get to that level of depth this evening, it does highlight some of the more advanced applications of radio. The other is an event that actually was just held today, so you'd have to check out a recording of it. But it was a conversation put on by the Kiev Independent. They did sort of an Ask Me Anything format, a Q&A, with their defense journalist, Ilya Ponomarenko. And so I was preparing for the space. I haven't had a chance to listen to that, but I'm sure it was a great talk. In the next item up, some recent podcasts just to draw your attention to. So the third from the right, there was a talk held on will the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive reset the war? That was put on by the ECFR and just held today. So you might enjoy that. There's a new episode of Geopolitics Decanted, which is done by Dmitry Alperovich, and his most recent topic was a discussion of the implications of AI, including military implications, and it's something we've touched on a little bit in past spaces. There was the most recent episode of the podcast that's run by the Kiev Independent, hosted by Anastasia Lapatina. Their most recent conversation was about everything that we know about Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, which, of course, this was a few days ago, and so it wouldn't include the attacks, of yesterday. But I think it's great context. And the last two, there is a series that's been done by the BBC, and the last episode in that was just released, and it's titled Next Year in Moscow. And this last episode is about the decisions that had to be made by dissidents in Russia, or perhaps they were just political opposition at that time, and whether to stay in Russia or in some cases return to it, or leave the country. So, we have done had some conversations about political prisoners in Russia. And so this would look at sort of that critical decision that some of those who are currently detained, that they faced a year ago on whether to stay and stand on their principles, or whether they thought they could do more effective work outside the country. And then finally, in this tweet that's titled Podcasts, just wanted to draw your attention that Sal Mercogliano, who has been a past speaker in the Spaces and who partly inspired our conversation about naval matters tonight, he has a podcast that he runs on YouTube. It's called What's Going On with Shipping. And, congratulations to him, because he just passed 90,000 subscribers. So I thought I would highlight that because he was a great guest here. And if you like the kinds of topics that we're going to discuss with John, I'm sure that you'll enjoy his podcast over on YouTube. In terms of resources, so I think this is the fourth item from the right, fifth from the left. A couple of interesting ones this week. I'll just run through them quickly. The Moscow Times put out a map. So I'll throw one or two of these up individually into the nest. But the Moscow Times put out a map that is a list of all the known Wagner burial sites in Russia. And occasionally, if you've been paying close attention, you will have seen attempts people have made to look at videos from those sorts of locations to try to count the number of graves, to try to estimate Wagner losses. And as the number of burial sites has increased, it's handy to have a map so that, when new satellite passes go overhead, we can attempt to update. There were two interesting resources that were AI-based, if you're starting to play with some of those tools. The first of which, tweet by Breck Castell. I put these up individually in the nest, where he walks through some plugins that he's used in order to translate videos in foreign languages, presumably to whatever language you like, but certainly to English. And that's just apparently a plugin for ChatGPT. So if you're using another tool at the moment, if it's a particularly long video, or if you're not very confident in the quality of the translation, then you might want to check out this plugin that Breck identifies. It might work better for you. There was also an interesting tweet put up about a new tool that's out now for ChatGPT called Code Interpreter, that apparently is extremely powerful in terms of statistical analysis, as in you can give it fairly general instructions, and as long as you understand the statistics yourself in a way that you can check the output, apparently it's being described as a huge time saver. So there may be some among the audience who do that kind of work and might find that helpful even in their OSINT work. I'll also note that the Moscow Times came out today and announced that they were going to make available all of their archives, which is 30 plus years worth of content. And, for anybody looking into recent Russian history to better understand what's happening now, that might be a great resource. I do try to highlight from time to time jobs that come up in the OSINT space. And so there is a tweet up there from the Washington Post. They are expanding their visual investigations. And in just the last week or two, it seems like
Mr.
many...
Blunt?
Yes.
It seems that you have a glitch.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you could speak to the Ukraine overview, and I'll just loop back in.
You bet I can. So Moscow time, or sorry, visual forensics teams from the Washington Post. They are looking for a 3D wizard, which sounds interesting as all heck. But you do have to be able to know how to code with Python, which I am definitely not that person, so I'll stay out of that one. The Ukraine overview, just looking.
Yeah, so a couple other things too. With the Washington Post ad, you also need to know, be proficient in Adobe, such as After Effects, Photoshop, Illustrator, and Premiere. And you have to be able to pretty much work with the news cycle and have experience with enhancing 2D animation techniques and have at least a degree of familiarity with 3D modeling as well.
Thanks for covering for me, guys. For those listening who don't know, I run these spaces through an emulator on a desktop in order to keep my connection more stable. But every so often I get a glitch in my microphone and I have to reset. It'll happen once or twice per space. Usually it takes a little while longer to become an issue, though. The last of the resources I wanted to highlight, the Atlantic Council has put out a new map that highlights sanction evasion programs that are known. And I hadn't seen it set out geographically before, so I thought that was interesting. And then finally, this is a follow-up to a resource that was first announced, I think, a week ago. And this is the Twitter account CatUXO for Unexploded Ordnance. They have begun releasing guides in order to assist experts in Ukraine who are demining or dealing with unexploded ordnance. Their last guide was on hand grenades, and this latest guide is on aircraft bomb recognition. Okay. In order to, so up in the nest, I do have a couple of interesting examples of OSINT from the last week. It would take a little while to run through those, so I think I'll save it at this point, but definitely please do have a look. And then before moving on to our guest, I will point out there is a tweet up there called Ukraine Overview that may interest you as well. And I like to put up a variety of maps, including from War Mapper, Institute for the Study of War, Poulet Volant, and others. I'll note that Andrew Perpetua, who's a friend of our space, and he's come and done an interview with us once or twice. He is now committing to a consistent schedule of Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m., which means there might be a little bit of overlap between his 8 p.m. presentation on YouTube and our conversation here. But I would definitely encourage you to check out his presentations when you can. The one other item in connection with Ukrainian overview, and this was interesting to me because we've talked about the sustainability of OSINT projects. So for example, when War Translated introduced a Patreon, we mentioned that as a worthwhile project. I noted that the account War Mapper, which has been producing good maps for months and months, has come out and enabled Twitter subscription. And that's interesting in that it's one of the first OSINT accounts I've seen going with that route, and also revealed that he's just an individual doing this work as opposed to a bigger team. So I wanted to flag that because investment in consistent daily output of OSINT content is hugely time consuming, and making it sustainable is an important thing to keep in mind if we're going to be getting value from it over months and years. Okay, so that was my lightning overview of resources. I'm very glad to have been joined tonight by John Conrad. John is the CEO of gcaptain.com, which is one of the leading publications on maritime matters in the United States. And I understand that John has also been a ship captain, and he is the author of a book called Fire on the Horizon. And relevant to our second conversation tonight, I think he's also a ham radio operator as well. So he's a man of many talents. And he's here tonight to talk to us a little bit about understanding shipbuilding capacity in the United States. So, John, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Michael and Exit, for inviting me. And thank you, everyone who clicked on that button in the lower right to retweet this space. I am a ham radio operator. For those who came for the ham discussion, my call sign is K-Ship, Kilo 5 Hotel, India Papa. And I'm really excited to share a little bit about shipbuilding, merchant marine, world trade, and ham radio, and answer any questions that you guys have.
Perfect. And since we're putting our cards on the table, I'm a ham operator as well. And so my call sign is Victor Echo 3, Quebec, Zulu, Quebec. So if any of you guys can catch that, maybe you'll find me on the air someday. So, John, as we're chatting, I will put up some links, particularly to tweets and threads that you've put up in the past. I was hoping to chat about shipbuilding capacity. I gave you a bit of an intro of your background, but that was just the highlights. I'm wondering maybe if you could just take a minute to explain your interest in shipping and particularly in shipbuilding, and why you think it's critical, because you do cover it quite a lot here on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And let me say that this is a big topic that I'm very passionate about, and sometimes I get pretty far down in the weeds. So if I'm losing anyone, please don't hesitate to stop me and reframe the question or jump in there. How did I get into shipping and shipbuilding? I grew up in the Bronx, and I think I just went to the Intrepid and Navy Fleet Week and loved that. And when I got a little bit older, we moved to a suburb with a yacht club. We couldn't afford the yacht club. My father was a New York City fireman, but he knocked on some doors and got me on the crew of a sailboat, a racing sailboat with a former America's Cup competitor. And I fell in love with that. And I really wanted to join the Navy and see the world. Unfortunately, I went to the Naval Academy, and my father unfortunately passed away while I was in college of Agent Orange. So I moved back closer to home, back to the Bronx, and went to SUNY Maritime College, which is also where Dr. Sal Mercogliano went to. At first, I thought I wanted to go in the Navy. I thought I wanted to fly, but then I got out on the ocean on these merchant ships, and I realized these are the largest the largest objects built by man in the entire world that are mobile, right? And you can literally see the world. And unlike a Navy ship, and I have great passion for the Navy and friends in the Navy, but in the Navy you get very specialized in different areas of the Navy, and there's a lot of help there. So it's a lot more of a leadership thing, where the Merchant Marine, we often only have 20 to 24 guys on board doing really exciting missions, and you really get your hands dirty fast. Then I went and I was doing super tankers up to Valdez, Alaska first. They found out I was a computer geek in high school. Most people go on ships to get away from technology, but I love computers, and I got brought into the world of offshore drilling. I went to the drill ship to India, worked for the Ambani brothers, who now are the wealthiest men in India, and we won a Guinness Book of World Record for the largest gas and LNG find in the world there. And while I was doing that, the Maritime, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, all these newspapers used to have dock reporters who went down to the ships and the docks and understood the maritime world. But in the early 2000s, when Craigslist came out, the newspapers lost a lot of revenue and they got rid of all these specialists and went with generalists. Now there's only one old school doc reporter left. It's Carl Nolte of the San Francisco Chronicle. And I saw the opportunity, I saw the blogs, and it was really open source intelligence ideas going through Silicon Valley with some of these. And I said, hey, we could do this with SHIP. So I launched GCaptain and trying to share not just my expertise, but we have chief engineers, we have Navy personnel, we have a wide cornucopia of experts on GCaptain writing articles and digging into the news and intelligence. So that's how I got into it.
That's a fascinating and varied background. And, finding that niche, seeing that the major publications were kind of dropping coverage was a great insight on yours. So you've written a fair bit about shipbuilding capacity. And, for example, for the reader, for the listeners, I've put links to some of your articles up in the nest on, for example, the shipbuilding crisis and coming logistical problems. And so what I was hoping to do was to understand, are you focused primarily on merchant shipping, or do you have a keen interest in naval matters as well? Because often when these topics come up on Twitter, the focus is on, the size of the Navy. Should it be ultimately a 500 ship Navy, or can the United States get by with a leaner fleet? Or are you focused more on merchant shipping?
What really interested me, and I just had if you go to simsec.org, I just did a podcast with them. They're like a Navy junior officers talking about things about ham radio and rebuilding Loran C, which was a precursor to GPS, using ham radio enthusiasts. Well, that came out of, understanding, talking to some Air Force guys who are putting flex radios onto all the big bombers because they're worried about a space war, and the Navy really isn't looking into this. So that was a couple of Air Force officers who were like, "Wait, this is a critical need." I've also written about shipbuilding and the icebreakers, how our icebreaker project is really falling behind because the Coast Guard guys that I know have said, "Hey, this is a critical need. We only have one left. It keeps catching fire. This is a major problem." So I'm kind of when we started GCaptain, we wanted to cover everyone professional from sailor up to CEO, all the different topics. But what we really look for is those real experts, the needles in the haystack, who are screaming at their top of their lungs, "Help me! We have a problem here," sounding the alarm, and no one else is paying attention to. So that's why we encouraged Sam Mercogliano. He was writing about the sea lift issue and how we need tankers in the Pacific War and we need the shipbuilding. And he was screaming about this at conferences and stuff. And I said, "Hey, Sal, come write for us." And then when the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal, I was getting calls from BBC and CNN and all that to come cover this. I said, I can't cover this all, Sal. Come help me. And that was the start of his channel. So that was just one individual voice who now has the 90,000 subscribers on YouTube. So, but most of these people in the shipping world, like I said, they kind of go out to sea to kind of get away from technology. They don't want to come on podcasts and such. The Navy obviously has security rules, and a lot of those guys are taciturn and don't want to talk about this. So we try to be that voice, seek out those people who are really screaming, "We have a problem here," and be that voice for them and focus our attention on those. And there really isn't that we have a lot of problems and rapidly escalating problems right now. But one of the absolute biggest problems is the shipbuilding problem. And it's something I know about because, my resume is a lot longer than we want to go into here, but I did spend over a year in South Korea building the most technologically advanced ship in the world at the time for BP. It was a multi-billion, multi-ship project. So I do have that shipyard experience, and I have some idea of what's going wrong here.
Well, it's a subject that's interesting to a lot of our listeners. I I know my co-host Intel Schizo was in the Navy, and I see that Sal has joined us as well. So I'm glad to see so many folks with this kind of experience with us today. So since you at GCAPTAIN cover kind of the gamut, I'm wondering, do you think that perhaps we can just set the context? And so do you think that the gap or maybe lag in shipbuilding capacity in the United States, is it more of an acute concern in naval circumstances, or is it more on the merchant side? Because that might be where we should focus our time.
Well, I think first we have to correct that it's not a gap or a problem in shipbuilding. It's a full-blown crisis right now. This is something that really needs to sound the alarm. I talked to multiple senators and representatives this week. Congress's attention to this. The General Berger, coming out of the Marine Corps, came in a thing and apologized for not being able to get Marines to Sudan for the evacuation. They had to send a merchant ship. So, I want to escalate this up. I don't want to sound panicked or anything else, but this is a full-blown crisis, Michael, and primarily a crisis for the Navy. We gave up our merchant fleet many years ago. It was the first industry that got deregulated, not fully deregulated, but outsourced to foreign labor. And we have very few ships, American flag ships right now. It's about 80 in international service, and you have about the same in domestic service. But we really don't have many merchant ships left. We depend on our friends and allies, and most of what comes in on foreign ships. So we do need to build merchant ships here. Absolutely, we need. The military has a lot of sea lift ships, they call it, which are merchant ships that are a little bit changed for the requirements. All of this stuff, the heavy stuff going over to the Ukraine, the tanks, the heavy ammunition, that is all going on merchant ships. So they project 75 to 100 additional tankers if we are going to fight a war in the Pacific. So yes, the merchant shipping is an absolute need, but probably even more so is this Navy shipbuilding, and that's a supreme concern for me, because the commercial world can ramp up a little faster than the Navy if we have financial incentives, if we talk to Wall Street, if we do things called financial engineering, if the government backs some of these highly risk loans, if the government just steps out of the picture and provides the risk management and banking, similar to what we just did with Silicon Valley Bank, the commercial world will step up, and we can ramp up quickly. We can ramp up shipyard capacity fairly quickly. We can start working with our allies in Korea and Japan. But the Navy's still stuck. No matter what the Navy seems to be doing lately, it's making the wrong steps. It's making the wrong moves. Every single Navy warship project is behind schedule or behind budget, and there are some absolute major failures. And it's not just the building of new ships; it is the repair of old ships. Just the ships that need to be repaired every year or two, get the rust knocked off, and do regular maintenance to the spy submarine, the Connecticut, which hit a seamount and needed to be repaired now. That's already been too long. It should have been repaired by now, but they're expecting another 5 years. So, I mean, this is a crisis across the United States, and it's becoming a crisis for our allies too. Korea had the best shipbuilding yards in the world: Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, and now they are quickly losing market share to China. So is Japan. And our Europeans, they were never as strong as the Asians, but Japan, I mean, Germany just closed their largest shipyard. It just went bankrupt with the cruise ship collapse. Denmark closed or throttled back its shipyard that they were doing these mega container ships. So I mean, China is really sucking up all the capacity here, and with this world crisis, right? You see the news and you say, hey, there's an inflation crisis. Well, where did that start? It started with the port congestion. Once the port congested, products couldn't get through, prices went up. And then once McDonald's and everyone else said, hey, we can raise prices without the customers getting mad and blame it on ships. Some of that was systemic, and some of it was, hey, we can continue raising prices because we have something to blame, the ships. So inflation started with ships. You had the world food security crisis. You had people are going hungry now, and it could be millions facing serious hunger. Exit has been doing a wonderful job looking at the food grain going through the Black Sea. But it's not just food coming out of Ukraine, it's fertilizer going around the world. And then you hear all about this energy crisis. So the food is a shipping crisis. We have plenty of food, but it has to be farmland, it has to be fertilized, and then that food has to come out. This can't go on planes, it's too heavy. It can't go on trains, it has to go on ships. And we are completely sea blind to it. Now you have the energy crisis. These fixed pipelines, any fixed asset, are now very vulnerable. You had the cyber attacks on the Colonial Pipeline in the United States, which showed that we have serious cyber vulnerabilities. And then you had the Nord Stream attack, which we still haven't figured out. You had the Kerch Strait Bridge explosion. And then you had the closure of Red Hill, the largest ship fuel facility in the world, and Hawaii was closed because the Navy couldn't handle maintenance. So you had this falling apart of fixed refineries, pipelines, and other assets, which means you have to move it on ships. And by the way, you have a very limited number of ships in the world. They were on the more efficient route. Now that ship that was going between Russia and Germany on a short run has to go all the way to China. So instead of being out of service for just a few days, it's out of service for weeks because it's got to go a lot further. So we just sucked out all of these wars and geopolitical strife. And by the way, in the Persian Gulf, because the Navy has a shipbuilding crisis, because they don't have enough ships, they can't patrol even the Persian Gulf. Iran's taking ships there. So because of all this, all of these crises that you see in the news are really, if you put a fine enough microscope on it, it gets back to ships because over 90% of world trade is on board ships. And we used to, whenever this happened, this is a boom and bust industry. Whenever there are high rates like this, all of the ship owners go and they all buy all these ships at once, which we're seeing in the container shipping world right now. And then there's oversaturation, and you'll have 10 years of absolute misery in the shipping because everyone built too much. Well, this time is different because of these closures, everything moving to China, and then China being behind because of COVID lockdowns and political strife. You don't have the capacity. And by the way, the container ships made so much on this port congestion, they're building everything they can. So we don't have tankers, we don't have LNG ships, we don't have these sea lift vessels. We can't get this extra capacity in. And in the United States, our shipyards are basically broken. And sorry, it's a big topic. Like I said, if any time, jump in here and stop me from rambling because there's a lot to cover.
Well, that was a great comprehensive overview. We'll dig into some of those. And just a note to the listener that John told us that he has about an hour, maybe a little bit of flexibility on that. So any conversation we have tonight is going to be an introduction and hopefully revisiting the naval issue is something that we'll do fairly consistently to dig into more specific issues. Before going to hands, I just want to clarify that, John, when you say that it's a full-blown crisis, I was going to ask, by what metric? But I think you covered all these bases, but just to reiterate, you're saying that it's an issue not only for projected conflict potentially with China in the Pacific, but also on the economic front, and also in terms of the Navy's current operational obligations. All of those are reaching a critical point. Is that right?
Absolutely. And then the Navy's the most critical because the Navy's the backbone of all of this. If you go back this really starts with Admiral Perry opening up Japan. When Admiral Perry opened up Japan in the 1860s, Japan went from a medieval economy to a superpower on the equivalent wavelength of most European in 30 years. So you look at this rise of China, and everyone says, this is amazing. It's never been done before. It was done with Japan. Teddy Roosevelt saw this. His good buddy, Alfred Thayer Mahan, he brought him in, and he had Thayer Mahan analyze this. And Mahan said, the strength of nations is the world trade, and that world trade has to be protected. This was a time where sailing, there were pirates, there were rogue nations, there were a lot of enemies at the sea. There were a lot of ships being sunk and taken and stolen. And Mahan says, if you want the economic power of a country is based on this world trade, and you fast forward this until World War II, and when World War II happened, the geopolitician Peter Zeihan talks about this, where the United States said everything was devastated, right? Europe was devastated. Japan was devastated. The economies were completely blown. And the United States said, hey, listen, we will open up our markets. We will flood you with as much capital from Wall Street as you want to rebuild. And we will open up our vast markets with the baby boomer population to sell all your goods here. And we just asked a couple, and we will protect all the trade. Any trade in the world, the U.S. Navy, U.S. taxpayers are going to pay for this all. We just asked, a couple things. One thing is you use the U.S. dollar because we need to control this currency. The second thing is you don't attack any ships or do any of that thing. So this was kind of the agreement, and the Europeans and the Asian, most countries did not sign up for this at first. There were only two countries that we could force to do this. That was Germany and Japan. But this program worked so well that their economy shot up so fast that everyone else slowly signed up on this. And as they signed up on it, we didn't want them to have navies, all these countries. We wanted to protect one navy that would maintain freedom of navigation, would protect these commercial ships. And it worked so well that we forgot about it, right? And then fast forward to 9/11 happened. I said my dad was a firefighter. He lost his entire fire truck. It was devastating. But we turned to the global war on terror. And at that point, we turned our back on the Navy because everything was working great. There were no incidents, there were no problems in world trade. And the less we did, the less we focused on, the more we gave it to our friends, the better it did, because U.S. politics, in case you haven't noticed, is a mess. So we didn't want to put our hands in this. We completely declawed our U.S. Maritime Administration to get the Maersk of the world and the Korean shipyards and let them have that piece because they were handling it better. And then some problems happened. You had the Somali piracy about 10 years ago, but the Navy still had some additional resources to go in there and form a group and attack this. But the Navy said we need more ships, and we didn't provide those ships. And then the Navy went on this program of let's do these mega ships. Let's get this Ford class with all of these goodies, the electric launch systems. Let's get the Zumwalt class destroyer that shoots these super weapons. Let's get this LCS super fast, lightweight, littoral combat ship up. They really saw, let's get away from the working ships. Let's get away from the salvage ships, the tugs, the fireboats, the cargo ships, the tankers. Let's give that to kind of the merchant marine. But again, we don't have a merchant marine anymore. So those things were kind of left to rot. And let's focus on these super ships. And they went to let's reduce capacity and go after capability. So we're going to have fewer ships, but these ships are going to be more powerful. But almost every single one of those projects became a disaster. The Zumwalt never got the cannons out. The ammunition was too costly. So they gave up on that. The LCSs started cracking, and the Ford is working. It just got activated, but it's been delayed 7-8 years. So it's way behind schedule. So now we're looking. We put all our eggs in this basket of the super ships, and now we don't have just the destroyers. We need the amphibious ships for the Marines. We don't have these, and then you also have, because the commercial died. Well, when the Navy's not building ships, or when it reduces capacity, to build super ships. You don't need all these extra shipyards. And because we were not investing in the commercial ships, most of them went away. Most of them went bankrupt. And the ones that did stay don't have the money to finance this anymore. And then this U.S. Maritime Administration, MARAD, does not have the regulatory muscle. It does not have the personnel. It does not even have the desire to really fund these shipyards. And meanwhile, because everyone's been focused on a landlocked war in Afghanistan, which, by the way, did require a huge sea lift effort. That stuff still went to Pakistan on ships, but the news never focused on this because we lost those dock journalists. We lost our connection to the maritime world because we had outsourced it to all our friends, and we didn't notice that China was really ramping up with this and using Wall Street money to build these yards, put our friends out of business, and our shipyards were already out of business. So right now, as the Navy's waking up, it doesn't know what to do because it's completely severed ties. You remember Mahan said it's a combination. It's 50% naval might and 50% merchant shipping. But we had such an overwhelming naval might after World War II. We had the luxury of forgetting our merchant shipping. But now, as the world is reverting, we're going back 100 years to when Japan opened up. Now China's opening up. We're reverting to these areas of piracy and state actions and mines in the Black Sea. Where everything that was old is new again. We have these super ships that don't work, and we don't have the tugboats, the fireboats, the oilers. I mean, right now, Michael, we have the most conservative estimate is we're 75 tankers short, and that's at the minimum. Most realistic projections are over 100 tankers that we need to get the fuel to our Navy ships. So even if we have the Navy ships, we can't go refuel them at sea. And meanwhile, the armed services fight over the budget. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy each have to share 1/3 of the budget. And they're continuously fighting over, and they pushed all of this on the Navy, which has the most expensive capital requirements ever, ships. So the Navy has the biggest expenses, the equal third of the budget. It's got all these other sea lift problems, and it's been ignored for the last 20 years. But even worse than that, who's in power now? General Miley is in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's an Army general. Secretary Austin, he's an Army general. So the power structure and where these fundings really go is in the hands of the Army. And they don't, even though the Army plays a much limited role in a Pacific war, they're not willing to give up this power. And the real problem is knowledge. I talk to these congressmen, the senators, the Navy admirals, now that they're waking up to this, and it really started with the port congestion crisis, with all these ships off the coast of Long Beach not being able to get in. Prior to that, the American public never even realized that these ships were coming in. Suddenly, America wakes up. It wakes up to the fact that 60 Minutes says we don't have a big enough Navy. The Chinese Navy's bigger. Suddenly, we have all these food crisis, energy crisis because of Ukraine. We can't get into the Black Sea. All of these things are happening at once, and everyone's waking up and saying, we have to do anything. And what does Congress do when it gets in panic mode? It just starts writing checks. And you can't just fund additional money into this problem. You're pouring money into a broken system, and it's leading to even bigger waste.
Well, so that's a hugely complicated set of problems. You began discussing the historical context, and it sounds like even if history doesn't repeat itself, it echoes. So it does sound like we have both good policy examples in history, as well as the bad. So hopefully we can draw lessons from those good examples. As we pick it apart, why don't we go through hands in the audience, and that way hopefully we'll get down to more specific questions. Because there are several hands up, maybe if you just keep your comments brief if you can. I didn't see the exact order in which hands went up. I do see OPSEC waving, and given his special status, we'll go to OPSEC, and then we'll run through exit all source, I think. Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so just quickly, when Mahan wrote The Influence of Sea Power, that was 1890, 1891, that was before the Russo-Japanese War, which is when we saw the switch to all big guns, which is what led to the dreadnought. So I do personally believe in sort of this neo-Mahan naval just looking for the word, but like strategy.
Oh, no worries, take your time.
No, but you can't take what Mahan wrote in 1890 and apply it to today. So I think navalism is still important, but it has completely changed from what he was talking about in the late 19th century. And everything that he wrote held true until we saw things like the dreadnoughts. And if you look at things like Jutland, they squared off exactly once during World War I. The United States has completely changed that with the aircraft carriers. So I just don't think that is applicable to what we're seeing with the United States Navy or the Chinese Navy. We're looking at a regional hegemon with China. They have 1, 2, maybe 3 aircraft carriers. They're not about to challenge the United States. So I think we are seeing this sort of neo-navalism, but it is not the same. And so I don't think you can take the influence of sea power and apply that directly to what we're seeing today. I do think that what the United States is doing when it comes to like freedom of navigation is very important, but it's not a one-to-one.
Well, please, I'm going to disagree with you here, but please stay on and ask a follow-up question, because that's my biggest frustration. I went to see the CNO 2 weeks ago, and they don't give you follow-up questions. So I'm a big believer in that, especially in disagreement. You're absolutely right. Mahan's policy on the big battleships, it did not work out well.
But he did. That wasn't his policy. He wrote that in 1890, and the all big gun Navy came about after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So he didn't see that.
So what's your point? What's your question though?
It's not a question. It's a statement.
Well, so since the issue we're discussing is shipbuilding capacity, when I take your point, OPSEC, when you talk about China having 2 or 3 aircraft carriers, I guess the concern is that given their capacity, that could very quickly become many more than the current 2 or 3, and then the question becomes, if they freely are moving beyond the first and second island chains, does it then become more like the Mahan state of the world? As in, could we move in that direction if it's not dealt with sooner? Do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, so in 2013, they put out a white paper. They were talking about their Farsi defense fleet, and what they're talking about was 2-3 decades away. So at the earliest, they're aiming for 2033, but more likely 2043. And just because they have the aircraft carriers does not mean they have the training or the wherewithal to actually utilize them. And I think that's one of the advantages that China has is they have sort of this consistent communist rule from the CCP. And so they can actually keep their eye on the target and keep moving towards that. But no, I don't think they're going to have that blue water Navy. They don't have the ports. We know
I'm gonna just respectfully disagree.
All right, go ahead.
If you want me to, and you're absolutely right. They do not have the training of the U.S. Navy. They do not have as advanced weapon systems. That's somewhat debatable, but I'll put our 1 for 1. I'll take our guys anyway. They will not have the blue water Navy that can go around the world. They will not be able to fill my hands thing and doing all these choke points around the world. And China has these major strategic issues coming up, collapsing demographics, oil security issues. They have to maintain their sea lanes from the Persian Gulf to even survive. So if they went to war, we could easily blockade them, and we have some of these strategic advantages. Now, that being said, the fundamental thing to understand about China is well, there are a few things, but one is the concentration of these forces in that first island chain and the vast distance it takes us to cross the Pacifics. General Pershing said that, colonels win battles, logisticians win wars. We are at it's the largest ocean by far, the Pacific, and we don't have a plan to get the fuel and the heavy ammunition to the Air Force and the forward deployment bases in order to counter this Chinese attack. It's going to take an enormous amount of sea lift efforts and the moving of ammunition. And by the way, in the Ukrainian war, we are seeing the rate of munitions use far exceed any of Pentagon.
Can we just put a pin in that? What exactly are you disagreeing with?
I'm disagreeing that we can challenge China in their backyard.
So that doesn't really have anything to do with I was talking about. I was talking about the Farsi Defense Fleet and their.
Well, you need to ask me a question because I'm here to answer questions. So if you have a question, I can be more specific.
No.
Well, so to the extent that this is a question about broad strategy, I understand it underlies the question: what level of capacity in shipbuilding is required? I appreciate that it's worthwhile, challenging fundamental assumptions. I would suspect that there would probably be broad-ish agreement that bringing up shipbuilding capacity from where it is now is important. Maybe just the question of to what level. So if you don't mind, OPSEC, so we have a ton of hands. We'll work back around to you, but I do want to go to a few others to get them into the conversation. I think that.
Just to be clear, I'm just saying that the white papers were talking about 20 to 30 years to develop that blue water navy. I'm not talking about any of the capabilities that John was talking.
Blue water, you mean around the world, that they're going to extend out past the second island chain?
A blue water navy. So take that for what it's worth.
I will agree with that. They will not extend past the second water chain, I don't believe, until, I think you're right about that.
So I guess that begs the question about what purpose should the U.S. Navy be put to in the nearer term, sort of in China's own backyard. But we'll leave that as a policy question. I believe next was All Source. Go ahead.
Hey, John, I appreciate you here and somebody, I have extensive experience with the Merchant Marine. I'll just say acta non verba, because I am an anonymous account, but I hope that means something to you.
It sure does. Actions, not words.
So it's great to have you. Obviously, anybody with my background reads a lot G Captain, so it's awesome to have you here and everything like that. And I understand, I think there's a fundamental problem with the Merchant Marine in our sea lift capability for logistics, either both in the military sea lift command, but more importantly in the civilian side in their ready reserve fleet. So more needs to definitely be done to increase sustainment. But my question is a little bit different than that. So, what we see a lot recently is a kind of shift and transition from China, a lot of manufacturing, and it's long term, but we're starting to see, especially in corporate America, a shift from trade with China to Mexico, right? And it's something I cover in my Twitter account specifically. My question to you is, if we start seeing, Mexico continue to increase its ability to be basically the manufacturer for America, right, and less China, do you believe that that would have a huge impact in U.S. merchant marine? Because basically now our largest trading partner, instead of being China, where we need and I know a lot of it is outsourced, of course, but still it's an important factor in maintaining whatever minimum merchant marine fleet we have. Do you think a transition to Mexico would be detrimental to the U.S. merchant marine capability?
Personally, I think the Merchant Marine is Rocky Balboa in the 12th round down on the ropes. I don't think we can get much smaller. Everything's already rusted. Everything, there's a slow trickle of input. I think we've hit our low water mark. Will it raise up to the level we need? I don't think so, but you make an excellent point about Mexico. There are huge opportunities in Mexico. And there's huge opportunities for reducing the size of our vessels. We require these enormous, huge ships like the Ever Given that got caught in the Suez to do this trade across this vast ocean of the Pacific. If I could get one thought across to you guys, is just no one really understands how huge the Pacific is. It's the largest ocean by far. So by nearshoring and reconfiguring, especially with Mexico, we have an opportunity to reduce those size of the vessels, and then we can have something that I'm absolutely passionate about, which is short sea shipping, using our inland waterways, using our harbors, getting goods moving up and down the coast. This is an enormous opportunity. So, it's kind of funny. Things are changing so rapidly, but the United States itself is in a fairly good area, right? We have fairly stable demographics. Mexico's got excellent demographics. Canada's got a lot of natural resources that have still been pulled out. We have South America and the mines in Brazil and all that. So we can be self-sufficient without the rest of the world, which is part of the reason why there isn't the political will right now to invest in the Navy and continue this Mahanian, global supremacy anymore, because quite frankly, we don't need it. And by the way, improving the docks of the Mississippi, improving the ports of Mexico, reducing, building these smaller ships, that's going to take a lot of money. And do we want to put that money overseas to a deteriorating world? This is the question that policymakers are having right now, and they're not talking about it publicly, but this is what the conversation is behind the scenes. Peter Zeihan talks about this enormously. So the United States is at a crossroad, and the real question is, it's not even about the Taiwan Strait. It's not about freedom of navigation overseas. We've already given up on that. We gave up freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, which Sal and I have been alone in calling against. I have to say, OST there, he's not alone. There are a lot of Navy personnel who would agree with a lot of my fundamental theory, but I'm bringing in the merchant side and the importance of that. As the world is kind of deteriorating into geopolitical mess, and a lot of that is on the backs of demographic collapse and food insecurity and energy insecurity. Well, we have all the energy we need. We have all the food we need. So do we need to help them? It's not about freedom of navigation. We can close down the Taiwan Strait. It's not going to affect the United States at all. What it really, the primary question at the core here is, what is the value of our allies? What's going to happen if our friends in Taiwan get invaded? What's going to happen if Japan or Korea get invaded? What will the White House's reaction to it be? And that's really historically, the America has been isolationist until our friends get beat up, and then we jump into the cause. And for the first year, we get our nose real bloody. As Winston Churchill said, America always does the right thing after they tried everything else. That's sort of what's happening here.
So two comments quickly.
Source, if I could just interject, how can you say that the United States gave up the freedom of navigation and used the Black Sea as an example when the Montreux Convention goes back to 1936?
Montreux Convention does not pertain to this particular situation. The Article 19 of the Montreux Convention says that belligerent states are not allowed to send warships into the Black Sea unless they're returning to their home port. The only belligerent state under the Montreux Convention is the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy can return Black Sea assets in. It can't bring its Baltic Fleet or anything else in. They're the only ones prohibited. But at the very same day, at the same hour they sent out that Montreux Convention, the Turkish government also came out and said, we also have a request. It's not part of the Montreux Convention, but we request that no other countries send warships in, because it's going to escalate the situation there. So it's a diplomatic request, and we can argue whether we want to go against the diplomatic request of Turkey, but this is a diplomatic policy question, not a legal question under the Montreux Convention. And we haven't, maybe we shouldn't, I won't get into that, but we have not pushed back on that request.
Yeah, but you can't say that it just negates freedom of navigation. I'm sorry.
Yes, because we haven't pushed back. We haven't requested that we send in, and the Black Sea is a NATO lake. You have Turkey, you have Romania, you have Bulgaria there.
You have Russia. It's not a NATO lake.
Romania is NATO. Turkey's NATO, and we've given up freedom of navigation. There are mines there.
It's a NATO lake because you have Russian.
It's not a fully NATO lake, but half of it is.
No, it's not a NATO lake.
So I think we're wandering a little further away than I expected from the issue of shipping capacity. So we're going to keep going. Allsource, did you want to ask one follow-up question from your?
I just wanted to bring up 2 points that John said, and I'll pass it on to Aaron. But so it's funny that you bring up the Pacific and the logistical requirements for that, because in my Army career, one of the units I specifically worked with, that was a huge undertaking. We quickly realized anytime we did any exercise or planning, that would have been dominated. A lot of people misassumed when I was having conversations. They would say, "Oh, the Navy is responsible for that." It's like, no, it's not the Navy. It's the Merchant Marine, right? For the logistical push that would be required, it's the U.S. Merchant Marine fleet that would lead a lot of that, not the Navy. And then the second point that you bring up,
and the Army watercraft and the Army services and the JLOTs. Yep.
Yeah, and then the second thing that I think is very important that you highlight is the inland waters of the United States. And where I went, one of the classes I took, I remember perfectly that one of the reasons why industrialization was so successful in the United States, and that it was such a huge economic boon in the United States in the late 1800s, was specifically our inland waters. We are blessed with our inland waters, and I would agree with you, John, 100%, that I think we need to go back, as you said, what's old is new again. And I think investing heavily in our inland water capabilities and the rivers that we have is an enormous economic potential that we just need to get back at to. So I appreciate those comments, John.
Thank you.
So before going to the next speaker, just a note, John had told us he had about an hour. So John, if at any point you have to get going, just let us know. We'll work through as many hands as we can. And to that end, because there were several hands up, if you can try to be as brief as possible, in posing your question to John, that would be appreciated. And we do have other people requesting, so we may rotate speakers as well. I think it was Russian Bridges next. Go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, John. I first started following you kind of around the inland waterways and some issues with Ukraine and the Danube and the Dnipro, and kind of bringing that awareness of how important those waterways are to Ukraine and Southeast Europe, and kind of some of our non-action on doing things there, with guaranteeing the rights of NATO and European allies, and it just kind of going silent. But I wanted to come back to your discussion about shipbuilding capacity and how much capacity the U.S. could start building ships. And if you'd like to touch on that, I basically come at this from this perspective that, in the U.S., that the 2010s was basically, if you were a welder, based on all of the large energy projects in the coast, like the LNG projects and the chemical manufacturing and stuff like that. If you're a welder, you could write your ticket, but that put delays on every project in the GOM, along the coast there. So I'm wondering, and maybe there's a little bit to do with the Jones Act in here with regards to building out the merchant marine and shipping and stuff like that, U.S. shipping. But if you could discuss that, if you see that as being a serious problem as well, as far as being able to ramp up U.S. shipbuilding capacity, and also if that ties into kind of offshore like rigs and stuff. So yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Right. I'm not going to get into the offshore because that's a whole nother topic, and we'll be here for 20 minutes. But and you're absolutely right on the importance of the rivers. I think a big reason for this war is that Mariupol sits at the entrance to the Caspian Sea and Russia's great inland waterways, and I think people aren't paying attention to this. Capacity shipyard. I disagree fully with the Navy's position on here. All the Navy leaders, the Chief of Naval Operations Gilday, the Secretary of the Navy Del Toro, they have all said we do not have the capacity in the U.S. shipyards. My classmate at SUNY Maritime, the CEO of Alabama Shipyards, they have plenty of capacity there. Their capacity at other shipyards right now. What we don't have is capacity with the current equipment. But if the financial incentive was there to invest in the equipment, the shipyards could really ramp up fast. The problem is these shipyards are so financially unstable that the loans they take out to expand are junk bonds, and they such high rates, it's not economically feasible for them to invest in the added capacity. Now, say even if we didn't have the room, which I believe we do, you have to look at the history of Korea. I spent a year and a half in Korea. Look at the map of Goji Island where the big shipbuilders are. They ran out of capacity very quickly in the early 2000s. And what they did is bring in these massive cranes so ship sections could be built on land and actually lifted out onto the water instead of these old school dry docks. They had floating dry docks. So you can start building capacity very easily out into the bay. The workforce issue is a completely other issue that's sapping our capacity, and you see this you see this in political debate all the time. You know, there's we have lost the trade craft in our high schools. We don't teach welding or put values on that area. Everyone's going to get business degrees and art degrees. There's definitely truth in that subject, but there are a couple of caveats that you have to understand. And that first caveat is that we train our shipyard workers to do everything because we do not see when you build a ship in Korea, everything is done to the nanometer in 3D rendering software. You know, when you talk about Facebook Oculus, that's already done in Korea. You walk through the ship with 3D goggles, and you can actually put your hands out to the handrails, and you know where everything is. You can operate equipment. So they don't start cutting steel until that is absolutely done. What does that mean? It means the welder, I get hired as a welder and I just do right angle weld, or this guy gets pulled in as an electrician and all he does his entire career is pulling cable through the wall. They're very specialized, and when you specialize down to that little bit, you don't need this wide training. In the U.S., we train our shipyard workers to weld, to do electrical. You know, you have to have basic mechanical skills because the Navy's always changing requirements midstream. So you may be a welder one day and have to be a plumber the next day. So we really overtrain, and what that does is it makes our workforce really competent when they actually have to do something unusual. We're like the Ferrari of shipbuilders now. We can build these crazy ships like the Ford, but we can't build fast. So that's one issue. Is if we do better modeling, we can reduce the need to pretty much overtrain our workforce. The other issue, and this is a lot more politically sensitive, is the other reason the United States is going very well into the future while the rest of the world is having trouble is because everyone wants to live in the United States. I worked at Shipyard Korea. They love Korea, but everyone wants a ticket to the United States. So it's a very simple immigration issue. We could issue the visas in an emergency. I don't think opening the gates and allowing foreign labor in to take American jobs is a good plan. But we have two things that we have to understand. One is the largest demographic of workforce ever in the history of the world, the boomers, is retiring. So this is why the Fed keeps raising rates and saying, why is unemployment low? It's because we are losing that workforce. That's one part of it. Second, the auto industry already showed us how to do this. Toyota came in with Japanese workers and built Toyota plants in Alabama and such, and established that culture, established how it's going to be done. They built the factory here with Japanese workers, and then they started training Americans to the Japanese way of doing something. So that's another idea. We could import as a temporary basis Samsung Heavy Industries, Daewoo into the United States, set up a shop with the financing, bring in Korean workers, and have them train Americans to that culture.
And to that end, I put in the Nest tweet. It has a couple of interesting details, including recent funding for small U.S. shipyards, but more to the point, it has some writing John has done about looking to Korean shipyards for examples in how they dramatically increase their capacity. So I would encourage you to check that out. I think the order was Aaron and then Gurney. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks, Michael. So, John, I'm Aaron Balma. I'm host of the Baum Military and OSINT Space and military historian and autism advocate.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, John. Certainly the shipbuilding problem is not just an American problem. I know for a fact that it is definitely as well, as you said, allies, including Canada. We have our aging Halifax-class frigates in Canada, and we have yet to be starting building the replacements of the type which would be the Type 26 from Great Britain. We did start and got, I think, 3 done so far of the Harry DeWolf class Arctic Warfare patrol ships. Not heavily armed, not nearly heavily armed enough, but it shows the capability that which we have lacked. It's not just in the States, it's here too, and it's also the lack of sometimes it's the oversight that is the problem. It's management problems of this and that, whatever. I mean, they've also had problems with welding, but regardless of that, I mean, yeah, I mean, in Atlantic Canada, where I am, or elsewhere, what does the U.S. Navy? I'm very concerned about Canada's Navy, but the United States Navy as well. I mean, they need to unmothball those old shipbuilding centers that were active during the Cold War, right? And get them.
Well, I would love to talk about. I spent the last week researching probably my next article, maybe in a couple of weeks, is going to be in Canada. I'd love to talk about my thoughts on Canada, because I think there's opportunity there.
Oh yeah.
Well, did you want to go into that for a moment? Because both Exit and I are actually Canadian, so we may hold the majority.
And me, I'm Canadian, and so Michael and me and Exit are Canadian, and maybe there's more Canadians here. There's got to be.
My sister went to McGill and I'm married a Canadian, so I'm very I love Canada, but. We'll first go into the systemic problems with Canada. You have all the amazing natural resources in Alberta, which have trouble getting out, and America doesn't help that. And you're right, you have some shipbuilding issues, you have port issues, but the biggest issue is the defense spending. NATO requires 2% of GDP spent on defense. Canada's only spending 1.4%. They're not pulling their weight in there, and there's probably not the political appetite. We won't go into the political issues. We have our own here as well, but there's a real political problem there. But that said, first of all, Canada does a lot of things really well that the United States doesn't. And in a wartime scenario, you need those heavy firepower, you need those weapons, you need those destroyers, the DDGs, which are excellent. I don't see Canada bringing up to that, but let the Navy do that. What we also need, the Navy says we do not have escort ships. So we're going to need those smaller, that Canada's better at, to escort our merchant ships in. So if we can bring that building up. But there's even a bigger problem here. And, how do you get the Canadian public to invest in this military? The politicians, I don't see that as an easy problem. But the U.S. is having a major, absolute icebreaker crisis. We have one left. We've poured billions of dollars and funding into a new icebreaker, new icebreakers to replace this. The project is going absolutely off the rails, despite the billions of dollars in government guaranteed contracts. And this is where, the CNO always says, if we can give them headlights in the future, they're going to correct their problems. That's BS. As you see in this project, they have billions of dollars in government contracts. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into VT Halter Yard to do this. And they just sold the entire icebreaker yard for $15 million. It was an absolute fire sale. It's going off the road. But this is where Canadian can do this. We don't need the weapons. We need icebreakers. We don't even need armed icebreakers, and we need the ports and docks up and down the coast of Alaska. Russia has an enormous icebreaker fleet that we need to be able to get to. So my suggestion, if I was talking to Sal gets called into the Canadian defense thing. Focus on what you're good at. Focus on it. Build those icebreakers and let us use it, jointly. Build those docks, build those commercial, and sell it to the public as, this is going to not only give us defense, but bring us economic, because right now with the Arctic too, you have a huge amount of money being spent on Arctic exercises. But all of these Arctic exercises, they have one thing in common. They fly in the materials into these Arctic exercises up in Alaska and Norway and everything else. Well, that's good for a training exercise, but some of us predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine before they moved across the border. And how we did that is we looked at the logistics. Prior to the invasion, Putin amassed a large amount of fuel and ammunition and food stocks on the border. When you have training exercises, you don't do that. When you move that head, you don't bring in those bullets and the food and the fuel for a training exercises. So in my view, all of these training exercises in the Arctic are pure fantasy, because the entire airlift capacity of the entire U.S. Air Force, including civilian partners like FedEx, is less than the capacity of one mega Maersk ship or one of these ever given. So the fact that we're going to be able to supply these on air into the Arctic is absolutely ridiculous. We're going to need icebreakers. We're going to need sea lift, and Canada can build those docks up there. The other thing that Canada is absolutely amazing on, we had the Bonhomme Richard, this amphibious ship in San Diego. It caught fire. We don't have a single fireboat in all of San Diego Harbor. They sent these tiny police boats with tiny water guns to try to put it out, and the whole ship burned. And I've been yelling, we need these. We used to have Navy fireboats, Navy salvage. We used to have all that. We gave it up. Canada still has it. When the Zim container ship caught fire up in the Straits to Juan de Fuca there, Sal and I both looked at it, and a bunch of us, and said, this ship is a goner. The containers caught fire. This is a total loss. This is going to be a disaster. I got on Twitter Spaces. It was really popular. And then the Canadian Coast Guard, which, by the way, it's not a military branch. It's run by merchant mariners, a hybrid. They came in with these giant salvage ships with these large water cannons, and they had the entire ship put out in hours. So my advice is we need these non-military icebreakers. We need the salvage ships. We need the towboats. We need the fireboats, and Canada can build those.
You need them nuclear powered as well, because the Russians ones are nuclear powered. It'd be better off to be able to do it that way and to match the Russian capability than to be. I mean, I know that nuclear power is not everything, but it's unlimited power, so you had the option. You know what I mean? You have that option. I mean, that's one thing that the Russians have been working on and have built is these nuclear-powered icebreakers, and it's a problem. It's also a problem up north because of our submarine, Canada's limited submarine capability. Diesel-powered, I mean, they're still very good, But we have the problem with, of course, that the Russians have a lot of nuclear attack subs and whatnot. So that's another problem as well. I mean, and so.
But you have to remember the Russian capabilities aren't near what we think they. If we can get close to them, I'm confident our military can sink the ships. But we can't get close to them up in the Arctic because we don't have the icebreakers, right? So I agree. I would love nuclear icebreakers. I think that's the way to go. But I'll just take 2 icebreakers that don't catch fire, which we don't have right now.
I also suspect that if convincing the Canadian public to commit to defense spending is a challenge in itself, then convincing the Canadian public to, not additionally, prevent the use of nuclear fuel, that's a separate hurdle, and maybe it would be easiest just to get something done, as opposed to nothing. John, if you're able to continue, maybe we'll just wrap up with the hands that are up.
If you're happy to have me, I'm happy to stay.
That's perfect. So I think the order was Gurney and then Exit. Go ahead, Gurney.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. John, been loving this conversation here. And I have 3 questions, but for brevity, I'll sort of give them thematically and just sort of ask you, one of them or whatever you get to here. So for somebody that's experienced more in the domain of ground combat, so from a layman's perspective of the sea, plugged into news sources and different things, it's one of those gray areas where it's sort of nebulous to a lot of the people that watch this but aren't completely involved in it or have a past experience with it. So my first question is sort of, what is the current state of survivability of ships in the current environment with both air, subs, autonomous drones, et cetera? I ask that to sort of set the stage here, just in terms of, we're talking about investment questions. You're talking about, investing in, merchant marine and a lot of things that are important in shipping fleets. So to set the ground for my 2 other questions, I just want to know, what is the survivability, the cost ratios here for some expensive ships? The second one I would get to, but just put it on the back burner, and that's just, the ready reserve fleet. What's your thoughts on that investment? Is it underinvested? But maybe to zoom in on a micro level to sort of answer that, I think a lot of people here, at least from the North American perspective, are aware of sort of the littoral combat ships. But it's sort of an enigma, even if you follow it, or at least to myself, for someone who's been following it for a number of years. And that's not the political side of it. But if you could just talk about, the need for investment and investment that has been given to these ships, and yet, a reallocation or reorganization of priorities or et cetera. Maybe that micro lens on focusing on littoral combat ships could talk sort of to my question about survivability, cost, et cetera. And I want to preface all that, I clearly believe there's a need to invest and fund in greater naval assets, in merchant marine and sea lift capacity. So I kindly ask you those.
Right. I'll try to wrap that all up into one answer. The littoral combat ships were designed to kind of do everything, and they have this modular package. So they have a anti-submarine package, they have an anti-ship package. They had these packages that can put on, and it didn't really work very well. They were built out of aluminum, which is not very survivable, but is very needed to go fast. But the real statement that wraps up the LCS is we've proven that we need to move somewhere else, that these are not working for us. We're already selling off and retiring ships. One ship is only 3 years old. We're selling it. It's only 3 years old and we're getting rid of it. But at the same time, we're still building more LCSs. We're almost done. But I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. The ready reserve, yes. I mean, drastic changes. I already said that we need at least 75 more ships, tankers only in the ready reserve. We need at least 100 ships, and that's not necessarily as expensive as you would think. But going to the survivability question, I think this is the most interesting. Navy ships are meant, most of them, they are not the old battleships with a foot wide of steel. They still have the compartmentalization and so forth, but they don't have, a lot of them are aluminum. Someone has some composite decking. They're not meant to take battle damage. What they do have instead are these amazing weapon system, both defensive and offensive. So as long as that ship has missiles, anti-surface missiles, anti-air missiles, it is a damn formidable thing. But the problem is the limited number of missiles on these ships. So when you start going into China, even with a destroyer, I don't know, someone's probably going to call me wrong. I think it has somewhere in the range of 90 assortment of these vertical launch missiles. Once you run out of that, if it takes, they estimate about 2 missiles to destroy a ship, and only a portion of those are anti-ship. Well, if you have 20 ships coming after you, or even 10 and 2 missiles apiece, you run out of missiles really quick. And once those missiles and the defensive systems are gone, there is no survivability. And we really saw that with the McCain and Fitzgerald collisions in the Singapore Straits and the South China Sea, where at one point, they got hit by a merchant ship. Very little damage to merchant ship, huge damage to the destroyer, and it knocked out their radio and combat systems. They actually had to limp back close to shore and do the Mayday on a cell phone. And this is really what got me into ham radio, saying, why couldn't they get the radios? It's so sophisticated that once they lose that, it's gone. But on the other side, the merchant ships, because we've moved to these double hull tankers, because we have bigger ships and we've had to figure out how to make them more survivable in the North Atlantic, these things are incredibly strong and incredibly stable. We've seen merchant ships in the Black Sea hit mines with minimal damage. We've seen just off the coast of Singapore, the entire deck's blown off this tanker, and the tanker is still floating there because of these double hull. So what does this mean? You can easily ruin the cargo of these ships with missiles, and a destroyer can definitely still take out multiple of these. But a lot of them will still float. And another interesting thing is, the U.S. used to have a militarized merchant marine. We used to go in for convoy training, communications training, basic weapons training at the Merchant Marine Academy. They closed down most of that. We still do some small arms in the early 2000s. And meanwhile, right when we did that, China started militarizing, giving this military training to their merchant marine. They have over 5,000 merchant ships, where we have less. We have about 80 in international service. Why is this important? Because in the Ukraine war, we've seen the effectiveness of these personnel missile systems, the Javelin and the Sparrow. Now, if you start handing these out to the merchant ships, a Chinese merchant ship with a crew that has some Javelin missiles and some Sparrow missiles, they go through the Singapore Straits, they see a Navy destroyer, they can come up close, it's a harmless merchant ship, they can pop out and they can shoot these weapons. And by the way, the Marine Corps is leading a lot of technology there. The Navy's still very pushing away from sea lift. The Marine Corps is going head into working with the Merchant Marine, working with the offshore companies, coming up with new things. Well, they tested it. They brought Javelin missiles out of the boat. They fired on commercial ships, and they're highly effective. So, suddenly you have the possibility to weaponize. They've already military training their Merchant Marine. You can weaponize these ships very cheaply and effectively, and they're highly survivable. They're not fast. They don't have the big weapon systems of a Navy destroyer, but there are a lot of them. There are 5,000 of them just in the Chinese fleet.
Did you want to come in with a follow-up quickly, Gurney?
Yeah, just very quickly. And again, and I haven't thought too much of this, John, but just if you could allocate resources here, like if you could give like, sort of a schema for where you would like to see resources allocated. Again, I get it. Like in a blue sky, we'd have infinite money for it, and we could balance things perfectly. But knowing that might not be possible, would you like to see more input on survivability and some offensive capability with Merchant Marine? If I boiled it down and distilled it and said, at its most basic capacity, you need sea lift, you need freedom of navigation, and what does that entail? So if I asked you to, surface assets, subsurface assets seem to be important and survivable. My question would be, do you think that distribution of resources integrating with a ready reserve in the merchant fleet, or making smaller, more survivable shipping assets at the cost of less production in terms of large cost capital ships. Does that make sense? Does it not make sense? How would you spend the dollars there to balance that out, to get the sea lift where it needs to be and to protect it, or make it survivable, or make it distributed to accomplish its mission?
Well, I think we got to this mess because we picked and choose instead of doing everything. I mean, you have to, the delivery, like these VLS cells, when they run out, the ship's got to go back to port. Well, we used to have destroyer tenders in submarine that could reload these at sea. We don't have that anymore. If the ship gets damaged, like the Fitzgerald does, we used to have salvage tugs that could go in there and repair it at sea and get it back in the fight. We don't have that anymore. We don't have the fireboats. So I think picking and choosing, we know what we need. We need it all. As terms of a limited budget, that's the bigger question. We've already addressed the capacity. I think capacity could be increased. I think we can work jointly, get Canada to work more on the Arctic resources and the thing, work with Korean shipbuilders. I think we have to work jointly with our partners, but at the end of the day, it's really a money issue. Wall Street is pouring an enormous amount of money into the Chinese shipyards. There was a CSIS, I believe, report that looked at how did China build these aircraft carriers. And what they found is the critical aspect of these extremely large and expensive dry docks that are hard to build. Well, guess who funded the building of those dry docks? It was Evergreen Container Ship Lines, which is a Taiwanese company. So literally, Taiwan's biggest company paid China and gave the expertise to build these dry docks that then China turned around and built the aircraft carriers with. And it was all funded by, a lot of it was funded by Wall Street banks, Wall Street things. Now, what Wall Street would love to invest in U.S. shipyards, but as I said before, when they do, the 86,000 employees of the NAVSEA, they create all these studies, they create all the reports, they have 1 million Zoom meetings, and nothing gets done. And the bankers are like, I'm walking away. This is too difficult. I just write a check to China, and they give me a dividend every year. So we have to we got to cut that red tape, and we have to outsource it. And very luckily, we've already done it. There is one government ship in the entire United States that is, well, almost on time and almost on budget. It's supposed to come out next month. These are these large training ships for the state merchant marine academies, completely on time, on budget, because the Navy refused to build it. So they gave it to the Maritime Administration with the Ready Reserve Fleet. And MARAD only has 800 employees, and they said, we don't have the resources to do this. They outsourced the entire project to Tote Marine, a commercial company. And guess what Tote did? Tote turned to the Koreans and says, we don't know how to do this either, so we're going to subcontract it to you. So it's still American labor. It's still American. They're bringing in some supplies from Korea, but it's all that technology and stuff from the Koreans. The Koreans are managing it from there. Still American welders, and it's on time and on budget. So we really need the Navy to step aside and put these professionals. I mean, the Navy says that the Ford is the most expensive ship in the world and most complicated. It is the most expensive, but the most complicated is the LNG FPSOs, the Shell Prelude. I think a Navy aircraft carrier is $14 billion. The Shell was $10 to $12 billion. But it was $10 to $12 billion in a Korean shipyard, which is a quarter of the cost of a U.S. shipyard. So that's not a $10 billion ship. That's a $30 or $40 billion ship if it was built here. These Koreans are really good, and they're willing to help us, but all these crazy laws are preventing, and the politics are preventing them from even providing the advanced software and the logistical support to keep us on track.
Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so today, John, I'm not sure if you saw it, but Tom Shugart put out a thread about Costco developing some tech to transform a pulp ship into a car carrier. And so essentially that they can potentially use these ships to transport product both ways. And that the idea is that at some point down the line, if China needed extra sea lift capacity, this might be a technology or a way that they could use some of their other civilian cargo ships to kind of augment that capacity. I guess I want your comment on that, but I also want to know, what are the things that, like, as an OSINT group, what are the things that we should be watching for, and the potential options like this that we should be watching for, and where should we be watching for those things to stay informed on like the next step?
Excellent. I mean, that's an excellent question. And if you guys haven't followed Tom Shugart, absolutely go and follow him right now. An amazing resource, and a Navy submarine officer turned OSINT sleuth who's looking at, and the big question is, we have this thing, and if you look at Senate testimonies and stuff, one of the big factors is the Chinese do not have a very good amphibious landing force. They don't have the ability to land on the beaches, and Sugar's really proving that wrong with his intelligence into this, and saying that a lot of these are built for dual use. So we have pre-positioned supplies around the world, and we used to have them in the Med, Diego Garcia, and Guam. My wife was on one of these ships at the start of the Iraq War, and they just sit there in this beautiful place filled with tanks, filled with ammunition. There are several of these filled with medical supplies, MREs, and they're just sitting there on 24-hour notice. When the president says, they start moving, and they often have to get there before the Army, because if the Army lands and they don't have tanks. So off my wife was, everything was great. One day she's out of radio communication. I had to figure out how to use the ham radio to contact her, because I didn't know where she was. She was delivering the supplies to Iraq. So we have those. But what we do is, to save costs, we built these bigger ships, especially these ro-ros. And the ro-ros are floating parking lots, really. And those are ships that are not very survivable. There was just one that in Brunswick, Georgia, that ran aground a few years ago. And it took us years to salvage that. So they can very easily be sunk or damaged, and they flood very easily because these open car decks, and it's hard to get the equipment off. Well, the U.S. right now is looking to build more ro-ros because they're cheap. They're floating parking garages. They're basically barges. They're slow. They got flat bottoms, and you can put a lot of stuff on it. But that also makes it a very rich target, right, for the enemy, saying, "Hey, look at this big thing here. We sink that. We can eliminate an entire army brigade worth of supplies with one shot." What the Chinese are doing is they're not going for the ro-ro design. They're going for the fast ferry design. So we have fast ferries, and you just saw one go and evacuate some Americans in the Sudan because the Marines couldn't get there. They don't have enough amphibs. You saw the failed fast ferry in the Hawaii, and there are a few others around the world. But when we build fast ferries, we're building aluminum like the LCS. We're building them super fast and very vulnerable. In the North Sea, the Norwegians, the Brits, the French, the Netherlands, they build these. They're not as fast as our aluminum fast ferries, but they're a lot faster than the ro-ros, and they're a lot more survivable. They're across the English Channel, North Sea. If you go from Calais to England, you will be on these. This is what China's investing in, and it's what we should be investing in. We should have more of these fast North Sea, very strong ferries. We can give them to Washington State and have them go over to Canada and service Alaska in peacetime, but they're ready to move supplies in quickly. And then we can also, instead of having all our supplies in two places, Guam and Diego Garcia, and by the way, Guam, we don't even have a Patriot missile system, so there's no significant air defense for these amazingly valuable supplies. Talk about all eggs in one basket. But as we've seen with the Ukraine, tanks are okay, but what we really need is the Javelins, the Sparrow missiles, the smaller, more maneuverable forces. So imagine, instead of these two islands with huge ships with huge amounts of supplies, we had 50 inexpensive North Sea ferries, commercial design, highly survivable, with the Javelins, the Sparrows, and the medical kits, the MREs, all around the South China Sea, throughout the Philippines, in Taiwan, everywhere. And then you have a rapid response force that really fits in a lot neater with the Marine Corps' Force 2030 design, being more maneuverable and outflank it. And if you did that, I think it would be very effective. As far as what you can do in the intel community, I think Tom Shugart is the master of this. He was a submarine commander, and that's his specialty, submarines. But he realized a lot of Americans are submarine experts. There are a lot of Navy. He picked that one niche that no one is looking about. He went to a lot of conferences, talked to a lot of people, and said, "Hey, what's the concern here?" And he quickly learned the concern was these amphibs. Right, the China doesn't have amphibs. So he said, "Let me think, if I was China, how I would attack Taiwan." And he realized you can use these ferries to get into Taiwan. You can build offshore, use offshore equipment to build temporary ports and stuff. So he found that need. I said in the beginning, I don't like to focus on anything big. I like to find those people who are screaming, like the Air Force was screaming about you need ham radio, and the Coast Guard screaming about icebreakers, and South screaming about sea lift. You have these little pockets of area where there are only one or two people who are like, this is a major problem, running the alarm bell, and everyone's almost dismisses them. I mean, some of the comments here, before where things got a little bit with OPSEC and stuff, this is good. This is good getting this debate out, finding these problems, and then kind of picking that niche where people think you're wrong. People yell at you a little bit, get in your face a little bit, and no one else is looking at that. I think you're the perfect example, Exit, of you focusing on these green. This is, you could potentially be saving millions of people of hunger because no one else is digging into this one tiny subject that is of vital importance, the movement of food out of the Ukraine. I think, as a new person into this community, open source intelligence, you don't really know what to look at, right? There are a million options, and most people tend to go to what's cool or what other people are doing. You need to find those voices who are screaming their heads off, I need help, and find something that they're not very good at, or something that's a little unusual or off. And just laser focus in on that one particular topic and be that expert. And then when something rolls around in that area or something, then the real experts, top 3 star, 4-star admirals are going to suddenly call you and say, invite you to talks like they do with Tom Shugart. He was a Navy captain already, but you become that expert in that particular space.
Well, that's great advice, of course. Focus on your niche. And while the conversation was heading back and forth, I did put a couple of resources up in the nest that were spoken to. So I found that CSIS report that John referred to, looking at how commercial money was going to fund Chinese, or it was assumed it was going to fund Chinese naval development. Tom Shugart's thread that we were just referring to is up there as well. And then, of course, I put up John's thread about Arctic security and the role of icebreakers, just so you have all that for background reading if you're interested. John, if you're okay, I think maybe I'll take one last question. I think Jane may have some policy experience in this area, so we'll let Jane ask the last question. And apologies to everybody else, but John's given us so much of his time. I think we'll wrap this topic after this. Go ahead, Jane.
Thank you very much. I liked your presentation a great deal, and there are really huge issues you brought up here. The icebreaker thing, I totally agree with you. Awesome idea. And I wish that, the big Navy would get behind it financially. And I think the one thing I wanted to just ask here or bring up is, what happens with a lot of these less than sexy boats that are, not offensive, not the new hotness, DDGs or whatever that are out there in the carrier battle groups, is it seems like funding for ro-ros or whatever. Pick your number, ferries, just are never the things that America can get Congress to focus on. It always seems like between DOD, big Navy, and Congress, the money always goes to the hot combatants. And it's an unfortunate oversight in my book, and it seems like when the Navy has been downsized over the years, the downsizing always happens around the non-combatants or the less than offensive combatants, the guys that are carrying troops, carrying stuff, carrying food, weapons, whatever. And I'm curious to know what you think about that, and how potentially that can be countered.
Absolutely. I mean, the real heroes of, I keep going back to this fireboat because Sal, it's a topic of great importance to Sal. My dad is a New York City fireman, worked on a fireboat for a little while. There's an amazing ship, and they, you know, the Navy says, well, fireboats cause problems, and if the training isn't right, they can put too much water, and they go back to the Normandy sinking in World War II and all these. It's not a perfect tool, but you have a cadre of firefighters who are ship training experts. They have all the equipment. They cross-train with the Navy, and it works really well. Canada proved it with the Zim container ship. If you have that, it works well. And we were down. This is Pearl Harbor. This was we did not have the enough salvage vessels, and we did not have enough salvage equipment in Pearl Harbor, and they had to fly all this equipment in. There's an excellent series of books by Admiral Ellsberg, I think Edward Ellsberg, on the salvage efforts in the world seas. You know, ships get damaged; they have to be repaired. Why build a new ship if you could just fix one with a hole in it? That's incredibly important. But you know, the most frustrating thing is, but yeah, you're right. The Congress didn't care. And the Navy's not a very good advocate for itself. The Navy's not an advocate for itself because it was left out of the global war on terror. And the Navy tries to help other people. And the Army said, we need more people. So they sent in intelligence. You look at Pete Buttigieg, you think, well, he's Department of Transportation. He's in charge of the Ready Reserve Fleet. Why isn't he funding it? Well, he never spent time on a ship. He was sent to the jungles of Afghanistan to work with the Army. And so the Navy didn't advocate for these other ships, and it was told to cut budgets. And how do you cut budget and maintain that capability? You come up with the super ship. I don't think it was illogical, but there's no replacement for money. But here's the real sad part, right? I've talked about the amazing shipyard capability in Korea, and it's getting sucked away by China, and they're losing jobs in Japan. I've talked about the amazing salvage and fireboat capability of Canada. Canada's natural expertise with the icebreaker. We have the German shipyard and the German specialty, and then you have all these other specialties that I'm not as familiar with the towboats and the minesweepers of the Netherlands and the corvettes, I think, of Norway. And all these nations and friends have these capabilities. And the Navy works with them, but they don't advocate. You have to see the Navy and the military has an enormous amount of political influence with the U.S. public and the U.S. Congress. And I've been talking to congressmen. They're interested in funding this. But as I said, the upper echelon of the military is Army. Navy, the complaint I hear all the time is OSD. OSD is blocking this. That's Office of Secretary of Defense. The Navy can't, because they're military, they can't leave their chain of command. They can't go on TV and say, we are screwed here. They can't go to Congress, we are screwed. They are having those conversations internally, but it gets to the top rung, the Secretary of Defense, and he wants to prioritize Army and prioritize the land war in the Ukraine. And the Navy does not get, and no Navy admiral is willing to come out and go on media and camera. But here's what the Navy could do, and I think they should do, lend that political influence. They don't have to say that they're weak, but they can go to the Canadian Parliament and say, hey, this is what we need. We need icebreakers. Can you help us? Can we have more basing? You know, they're doing this right now with the Philippines, getting more bases. They can go to the Koreans and say, hey, can you build some of these ready reserve ships for us? Can you help our shipyards? They can go to Wall Street and say, hey, Wall Street, I have an old article on shipbuilding is collapsing because admirals don't understand finance. There are all these capital projects and financial engineering, and we're using bonds that were created before World War II. We got to get up to the times, and the Navy doesn't have the money, they don't have the knowledge, but they have the influence. If the CNO goes to Wall Street, if they go up to the Canadian, that they go to Korea, and they stand behind these and get them on TV saying, Canadian Admiral going, we really need icebreakers, and Gilday and the Secretary of Defense stands behind them and say, yes, we fully support this project. If they went to the DOT when they're crying for ready reserves, yes, we stand behind this. Fireboats, Port of LA, it's a city issue. LA City bought the fireboats for the Port of LA, and by the way, Long Beach has these amazing fireboats. Well, the Secretary of the Navy could go to San Diego to the fire department, grab the fire chief, bring him to City Hall, and say, "Give this guy money. We don't need money. Give it to him because he's going to help us keep these ships from burning."
Okay, well, John, you've been very generous with your time. Obviously, this is a subject that people love to discuss. It's so complicated that I know we've only scratched the surface on a lot of aspects of it. But thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you've enjoyed your time enough that in a couple of weeks, a month or two, maybe you'll come back and chat with us on a more focused angle of the question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute wonder. I have 5 minutes. I can go to 11. Is there one really quick ham radio? I feel bad leaving without, because I'm so passionate about that too. Does anyone have a real quick ham radio question?
Sure. So if anybody wants to come up, in particular, if anybody has a question related to the Loran-C system. So you know what, maybe I'll just take the question. So we'll see if anybody comes up. But John, I read that really popular book, Ghost Fleet.
Yes, great book.
Yeah, right. And so the efforts that were being proposed to upgrade these radio systems ashore in order to fill some of the gap if GPS were to go down, how much of the problem would that solve? And if there are gaps in ability to navigate, if GPS is down, are there other solutions of this sort of older technological type that we should be considering to fill gap, short of going back to, sextant and compass?
Right. So Loran-C was very popular, very worked it out, but it took a lot of computing, and it was really ground pathways. So the GPS signals, they are very high or ultra high frequency. They're all line of sight, and they're very small, short frequency waves. So what does that do for you? Those higher frequencies, they don't need as much power, so you can run them off of the solar panels and the satellites, and they can transmit more data. The faster the frequency, the more data you can transfer. But there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is penetration. Once you walk into a basement, a parking garage, everything, you don't get that GPS satellite signal. But how come your cell phone still works? It didn't work for years, but they figured out how to tie in where that your cell phone is actually seeing wireless stations around the property or around your town. It's picking up potentially AM, FM broadcast stations, and it's doing the triangulation math on these terrestrial base stations. Some of these autonomous cars that went out with Google Maps, and mapped the entire world, they were also mapping your Wi-Fi signal. So when you approach a neighbor's Wi-Fi and yours goes down, it knows where your Wi-Fi is, it knows where the neighbor's is, and it adjusts. So even if you lose that GPS, it adjusts. So that's what we can basically build with, I believe, a ham radio system. The Loran system used the opposite, these very big waves. that require a lot of energy, a lot of watts put in, and they're ground. They go across the ground, but they have massive penetration ability, so they could get into garages, they could get into everywhere else. But it would be too big, it would be too expensive, and the ham radio operators cannot manage these low frequency signals. So we can look at a hybrid solution. Ham radio operators are already using FT8, and they're already sending these signals out. And some of these signals bounce in different ways. Some of them aren't synchronized correctly with the clock. There are all these problems, but if you put an AI algorithm into the system, and just like they're doing with your local Wi-Fi, and start figuring out which of these signals are accurate and which of them can be used for positioning, I think then you could have a maybe not a low frequency, but you could have a medium frequency backup for GPS. We already have a backup for GPS. Of course, it's the Sexton. We still carry them aboard ships. We've carried them for hundreds of years now, but these systems cannot go into advanced navigation computers. They cannot go into weapons defensive systems. They can't be used in real time. So we need an alternate that does not have the penetration issues and basically the satellite survivability. You have problems with a space war, but you could also have a Carrington event or a meteor shower that takes out GPS. So this is an opportunity to kind of do a stopgap. And I talked to scientists at MIT. They're not 100% sure that it could work. They think there's probably a 50 or 60% chance if it works. But if it does work, it would be a 100% solution. It wouldn't replace GPS, but it would augment it. So if your GPS went down, this is an alternative system that you can jump to. And it's one that could be run by amateurs who put in their antenna location. Possibly they upgrade, like I said, Flex Radio is having this program with the Air Force. So maybe the Air Force creates a better timing module and gives it to a select number of civilians. There are a lot of options, but someone's got to put some resources in to get the ham radio community together on it. And because GPS, we can't rely, it's so critical, but it's vulnerable to cyber and space attacks.
Well, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard about that work on L'Orient C. For those who would like to learn a little bit more about it, in the nest, the second item is John's article on it. And, particularly could AI be used to assist in establishing this system, which is a fascinating question. And then I realized that I made reference to the book Ghost Fleet without explaining it. John explained, some of the fundamental concept, but I also put up a link to a book review from, a good Intel analysis channel, Divergent Opinions, that I follow anyway, who looked at the book. It's by Singer, with the concept that an enemy takes out U.S. satellites, thereby taking out GPS navigation, and that...
and also militarizes the merchant fleet, right?
Right. Well, and that they have to pull out of mothballs a bunch of older Navy ships because they just need the hulls, but then also, their electronic systems and weapons aren't as reliable. And so it's a bit of a fantasy more for planning purposes, like a what if. But John makes the great point that it's just additional reliability. What if there are massive solar storms or the like that disable things? Thinking about whether the ham radio-based system could be established through volunteers is very interesting. We have had other speakers come in to talk about radio volunteer programs, in particular the ACARS project that's being run by the Bald Geek here on Twitter. And so that idea of, big collaborative projects is really intriguing to me.
And there's MARS, Military Amateur Radio Service. The Navy and the Coast Guard got rid of theirs. The Air Force, because they understand the supposed vulnerability, maintain theirs. But we're really trying to push our congressmen and our Navy to reopen the Navy and Coast Guard MARS, because there's a great need for that. So please check that out. And if you're a ham radio, try to join MARS and ask for the Navy program.
I didn't know that about Mars. That's interesting. I do know that some among us, I think, have participated with that program. So that's really interesting.
All right.
But
Well, thank you, guys.
thank you, John. If you have to go, that's great. If you're able to just stick around and listen, that works too. So another hat that John wears that I referred to at the beginning of his time here is that he is a ham radio operator. And that's the subject I wanted to come to next in our conversation for maybe the next 20 minutes or so. And that's just by way of making an introduction to the audience, as it's a subject that I think, it has a lot that we can dig into. There are a lot of applications of ham radio for OSINT work. And so just by way of introduction, I wanted to highlight to the space just how many among us already are ham radio operators. And I suspect that even if you're not, if you're interested in this area, the thought has probably crossed your mind at some point that it might be handy to go out and learn about. So maybe just a quick survey by throwing up emojis, hearts or what have you. How many among us are ham radio operators, have their licenses? I know that many up on the speakers panel certainly do. And so we actually began a conversation about a week ago in a space. And there were a lot of audience questions about it because it seemed like many people were interested in it. And so this is just going to be a brief introduction to the idea, and both to flag if there are other ham operators in the audience who would be interested in coordinating presentation of material on it. Please do reach out to me via DM, because we'll work up further presentations. And if you're somebody who's interested in it, just to really encourage you, set aside some time to pursue it, because it is, I think, both entertaining, but also incredibly useful when you might come to need it. And so to that end, I'm going to put up some items into the nest. Sorry, just bear with me a moment. And in particular, I appreciate the support in the space here of ID10T, Paul, and Radio and Nukes, all of whom were involved in that earlier conversation I mentioned, and they're all pretty experienced ham operators who are going to help us out by chipping in on this background. So here we go. I'm putting up, first of all, a tweet that has some links to how to learn the basics of ham radio, and that includes links to the U.S. requirements, what the different types of licenses are, what you have to do to get your license. There's also a link to Radio Amateurs of Canada, which does the licensing up here, that set out the same requirements. There's a different system, although similar. Then included on there are some basics if you'd like to get started in learning. There's a link to a repository of ham radio jargon, as well as a company that sells the basic study guides. It's hamstudy.com. That would be helpful in getting you started. I also discovered, again, because I'm not in the States myself, but that in the US now, apparently you can do your licensing remotely. There is a station. Its Twitter account is there. The Twitter account is W5YI. And this station, it's a club that's based in Texas. And apparently they'll allow you to do your testing online. And I understand all you need is a camera and, sort of proof of ID, which sounds like a really convenient way to get into it if you're brand new to it. And then the last link in that particular tweet is, if you're interested in learning a little bit more hands-on, across North America, there's an event called Field Day, and all the various organizations will participate, and almost all local clubs will go out to a public place like a park or field, and they'll set up their mobile radios there, and all day they engage in contests trying to make as many connections around the world as possible. And because all of the clubs are out on the same days, it's June the 24th and, overnight to June the 25th this year. It's also intended to act as an open house. So if you have never gotten to use a radio, or maybe it's been a long time since you did, there's a link there where you can look up clubs' locations where they'll be setting up on that day, with the idea that they're very open to people coming out to get some hands-on experience and sort of an introduction to local clubs. So I thought we would also just go through a very brief, for those who, really haven't even worked at the basics of what ham radio is. I thought we would take maybe 5 minutes to chat about those concepts as illustrated by the photos that are up in the nest now. And some of these folks, ID10T, Paul and Radio and Nukes, have kindly agreed to sort of talk through the concepts presented in these images. And so just so you know, ID10T, I put the second from the left, I think is maybe the place to start with the spectrum and the idea of curvature of the Earth. But I'll leave it to you, if you're okay with it, to take away with some basic explanation.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so I'm going to touch on a couple things, but that box is going to be my focus before I hand it off. But you use a lot of radios. In your hand, around you, Wi-Fi, radio is everywhere. And I'm speaking to those of who have not thought of ham, and this might just be a word of old timers. But I'm going to start a little weird here, and I'm going to clarify a common misconception. You've heard of AM radio, you've heard of FM radio, and these were named by amplitude modulation, frequency modulation. There's another one called phase modulation. But at the time when AM radio came out, it was cool and high tech, and it was much more enjoyable than sitting with the family and listening to Morse code. AM radio sounded good. So when the government identified a frequency band, they called it AM radio to the public, and everyone knew what it was. But the AM part does not identify the frequency. We're going to go into frequencies. And then the FM radio. But yeah, looking at that chart, all the way down from VLF, submarine communications down at 3 kilohertz, and up to light, up to and including light, this is a big chunk of the electromagnetic spectrum that establishes the infrastructure that you're familiar with. That's quite a big word. Radio was old-timey thing, but it is really the backbone of the way that you communicate. You've heard of AM, FM, AM radio being 500, very low frequency, HF, high frequency, VHF, very high frequency, UHF, ultra high frequency. Just some terminologies. I want to just establish how many radios you actually know of, in case you haven't thought of them. You've also heard of a CB radio, 27 megahertz, FRS radio. These are the little bubble pack walkie-talkies that you give your kids. That's in the 462 or the UHF band. Your Wi-Fi, 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. Your microwave oven, that's also 2.4 gigahertz. The difference there is your Wi-Fi is about 100 milliwatts, and your microwave is probably around 1,000 watts, and it's contained, and that's a good thing. Your cell phone, depending on how you count it, could have 4 or to 10 radios inside just your cell phone. Aircraft tracking, ADSB. How do we get the aircraft on the maps that you see the pictures of on Twitter? ADSB, about 1 gig. AIS. How do we know where ships are? Well, they're operating down the VHF range, down at 160 megahertz. They're transmitting. You might get it on a ground station or someone with an antenna on the shore, or there's a satellite above that also receives that AIS from that ship. So that's how we know where ships are in the middle of the Pacific when there's not a shore to put an antenna. Your GPS signal that you use on your phone, another radio, that's about 1 gig as well. Satellite communication can be HF, VHF, SHF. Radars of all iterations are radios. So yeah, they are everywhere, and they provide communication over a distance, be it voice or data. So that's established. Now, John brought up an excellent point, and that the Air Force is putting HF radios inside aircraft for in the event that there's a space and cyber war. So I made clear that there's a radio of that is the backbone of the infrastructure that you are familiar with. And if there's a space and cyber war, I want to put emphasis on the vulnerability of that infrastructure. So, talked a little bit about actual radios and a little bit of modulation. Now, what can you do with it? Other than having an amateur radio license, probably turning on and turning it off is your limitation. But if you get an amateur radio license, you have a lot more authority. You can play with it. You can make it do things. A walkie-talkie, for example, no. You can buy one at Walmart and talk to your neighbor. And with an amateur radio license, you can talk to a repeater. Well, that's the difference in 2 miles, maybe, talking on a walkie-talkie, or talking to a repeater that's on a hill. I send a signal to the repeater, and it repeats what I say out from on top of the hill. Now I've stretched, say, 50 miles. Well, that's a big benefit. I can also use that same little walkie-talkie and talk to satellites. Now I can stretch hundreds of miles. But really cool things happen in the HF spectrum. And if you talk to amateur radio guys, 9 times out of 10, if they're an old guy, they're going to say, hey, HF is kind of the goal. That's the end game where you want to go, because that's what opens up the world both ways. HF from 3 to 30 megahertz. The cool things that happen is you get to hear signals and transmit back from around the world, because they are reflected and refracted from the ionosphere. Let's see, where is that on that space? And you got a couple pictures up there. But you can see from the pictures you have a couple of signals that if it hits an obstacle, then the signal's done, or it exceeds the curvature of the Earth, that signal's done. We refer to that as line of sight. These would be your VHF, UHF frequencies. HF acts quite a bit different. It can go up and hit a charged particle layer in the atmosphere, and then kind of like light in a swimming pool, be bent right back down to Earth. Prior to satellites, this was a means of communication long distance. Ship to shore, or military operations where there is no infrastructure. Say a satellite's down, we still revert to HF radio, and we still use this same tactic to bounce a signal. As a matter of fact, there's quite a few entities around New York City, around the New York Stock Exchange, that if you look up on the roof, you'll see HF antennas, because low latency and I would say almost assured communication, but much more reliable communication than when the infrastructure's down to the internet or anything else. The New York Stock Exchange guys will have HF antennas constantly going. They pay big money for HF frequencies to send stock market data all around the world at light speed, not depending on infrastructure. There are military, financial, humanitarian, the list goes on, of who depends on these frequencies. By obtaining an amateur radio license, you get to learn the ins and outs of how to use these legally, safely, practically. The amateur radio license is a path to the knowledge. Much of the intercept information that you might see on Twitter is an amateur radio license required. No, not really. But it's a big hill to get over that knowledge without the practical applications and the knowledge that an amateur radio license brings you. So yeah, back to that, how prevalent radio is. You take a standard military cargo aircraft. This is not a SIGINT platform. This is not a fighter aircraft, just a C-17 that's going to haul cargo. You could probably count 24 different radio antennas on that one aircraft without any other special missions. GPS, VORs, the list just goes on. Radar, so many, 24 different radios. Now, you think of a SIGINT aircraft, 30, 40 more radios on that platform. They are everywhere, and the basic fundamentals and the knowledge that amateur radio can bring you, you get to know how those work. You know why an antenna is such a size, why there is such a placement, why it's standing up, why it's laying down. So radio communication provides communication at a distance. HF provides communication at vast distances. And in the event that a space or cyber war or solar flare or so many things go on, you don't have to be a prepper to think about it. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that can bring down what you know as the infrastructure of communication. This will alleviate that dependency on the infrastructure in the event you need it. I have family in Tennessee, tornadoes. I have friends down in Florida, hurricanes. I live in the Philippines, everything, political, geopolitical turmoil, typhoons, list goes on. I still have a means to send an email or to send a message saying, hey, I'm fine. Hey, this is what's going on. Because I've obtained an amateur radio license and I've honed my skills so as that in the event that I need to communicate in the absence of infrastructure, I have that ability. I'll hand that off.
Thanks very much for the basic description. So besides the idea of this is what radio is, it can be useful in many general ways. We already gave you a couple of resources for if you want to get licensed, where do you go? Where can you find local clubs? Potentially go out to meet them on field day. I wanted to speak to examples of how it can be useful for OSINT purposes. And so if you look up in the nest, it's the third item back. It's my tweet that is titled OSINT with radio, ? And I won't speak to all of the examples there, but these are all examples of recent use of radio for really important and unique OSINT purposes. But maybe what I will do is at least I think 2 of these entries are items that Radio and Nukes put up in the last couple of days. I'm wondering, Radio and Nukes, would you be willing to speak to some of the ways that you use radio for OSINT? Maybe either the Svalbard case or looking at some of the jamming?
Yeah, certainly. Radio is used by every intelligence agency, every military, every commercial maritime operator, as we've heard earlier. And it's not just intercepting radio, it's knowing how it works that becomes really important. For the Svalbard case, the satellite ground station in Svalbard, which is an island in the Arctic, a little bit of radio combined with a little bit of physics Polar orbiting satellites orbit the poles of the Earth, basically straight over the North Pole and around straight over the South Pole, and the Earth spins under it. And in the case of the big investigation that went on where they found out that Russia was likely tampering with undersea fiber optic cables running the Svalbard, well, there happens to be a large satellite ground station in Svalbard. It's well known. It's mostly a commercial ground station, but it also services some dual-use customers, as well as likely military customers. And that ground station happens to be there, and this is where radio comes in, because when these satellites pass over the poles, they need a ground station near the pole to see the satellite, that line of sight, because of the curvature of the Earth. Every time they make an orbit. And so far northern locations are ideal. Well, Svalbard happens to be an ideal place in the Arctic because it's an island. You can easily run a cable to it. It's lower ice than the rest of the Arctic because of the way the ocean is around it. And it just, it doesn't all have to be, when you think about radio and OSINT, it seems like it either goes one of two ways. It goes just straight to ELINT, SIGINT, COMMENT, communications intelligence, signals intelligence, and electronic intelligence or electronic warfare, or it goes to the hacking side, the flipper and the de-offing Wi-Fi and things like that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Just knowing how radio works can get you some insight in why did they spend all this money building this satellite ground station in the Arctic? Why didn't they build it in a better location? Well, weather-wise, well, the reason is that they needed that radio line of sight to the satellites. So this stuff's immensely powerful, and just knowing how it works, not necessarily having access to every tool on the Earth and every gadget and all of this stuff. Most of what I use is free and open to everyone. I live on the wrong side of the planet to listen to Russia in most cases. I use online web SDRs. They're free and open, and I think we'll probably get into more of that later. But this doesn't have to be an expensive endeavor. So I think that's a bit of an overview there. Turn it back to you.
Thanks very much. So, and again, there are lots of examples, including in this investigation into the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. It's looking now like some of the critical evidence will be amateur radio operators who happen to have been listening very closely to Russian transmissions from ships that, set them in a time and a place near where a ship would need to be if it were being used to attack the pipelines. So in some cases it can definitely be the whodunit, or for those who have been following the war for a long time, some of the first detailed information about the sinking of the Moskva came via intercept of Russian radio communication, or even with the recent missile attack earlier this week. I think it was just Tuesday night. The online ham monitors were talking about the takeoff of the bombers 6 hours before the missiles hit, so you can get insight that is not available in any other way. I know this is a bit of a hard sell, but we do want to, introduce it to the group and stress that it's valuable. And if you've ever considered it, maybe have another look at it now. To that end, the third item in the nest is my tweet titled "Try It Now," and there are devices called web SDRs. SDR stands for a software-defined radio, and so there are radio systems that can be set up so that you can remotely control them over the web. And I've put up links to tweets that include links to 3 of the most popular that you can go to right now. And, you don't have to have a license. It's listen only because in order to transmit, you need a license, and you can only have one person transmitting, but you can have many people listening at the same time. And it will give you some insight. And by looking at the setup of the different, radios that they're attached to, you can learn some things, including there's one in the Netherlands, there's one in New Zealand, I think the other is in the United States, and they have different types of hardware, different types of antennas attached to them, meaning that they can hear different ranges of frequency and so on. So, even through these free online tools, you can start to get a sense of what's possible. And I know there are definitely people who are doing some basic intelligence by monitoring through these stations, because in some cases people already have the knowledge, but if the signal is coming from the other side of the world, they don't have an antenna located there, but they can use these free ones that allow them to hear on the other side of the world when they maybe don't have a setup that can do it at home. And then finally, I'll point out as a resource, I am developing a Twitter list. So if you look in that tweet entitled "Try It Now," at the bottom, I have a section that says, well, how do you find the interesting things on the radio? And that's my new list. And I am trying to set up a couple of different lists, OSINT themed, that are fairly, focused. And so these are only accounts that track transmissions from ham radio in a military context. So it's not ham radio generally. There might be some, hardware tech tips that will come through that will only be relevant to people who follow it closely. But for the most part, it's discussion about signals that are on the air right now. And so you can take those tweets that are saying, oh, hey, this thing is happening on, this frequency. You can go to one of the web SDR channels and you can try and tune into it and hear it for yourself. So that's the initial overview. And again, if you sort of like, my friends who have helped me out, Radio and Nukes, Paul and ID10T, if you have your license and you'd like to contribute a bit more to presenting on these topics or maybe even working on OSINT projects in the background, shoot me a direct message. And so thanks to the three of you for helping me out with this. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, every 2 or 3 weeks, maybe we'll do a presentation on some more specific aspect of radio when we have a little bit more time to prep for it. Okay, so I am going to move on to general updates on Ukraine. And there's been quite a bit of news. We have 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes to run through it. So we'll see how much of it we can get through. And I'm going to start populating the nest with these items. Again, this is the type of content that if you have any comments or questions, please do come up and contribute. You can always do that by requesting the mic, which is in the, it's the button in the bottom left of the Spaces window. And so in the last few days, since Sunday, our Space on Sunday, there's been quite a lot of news, and it seems like a lot of it's been in the back and forth. And because there have been so many various strikes, I'll admit that even in putting this material together, I fell a little bit behind in recalling what the series of events was. But really, this all started with an attack on some of the oil depots in Simferopol in Crimea, and that then prompted Russia to, it was believed that their response was prompted then to launch an airstrike that everybody thought was going to be a huge airstrike, because something like 14 or 17 Russian bombers went up in the air. Ultimately, my understanding is that only 14, I just distracted by messages in the background, that only something like 18 missiles were fired, of which 14 were intercepted. But then, while everybody was thinking about the implications of the strikes on the oil depot and the Russian response, then we were all kind of distracted by the explosion of several drones over the Kremlin. And then this afternoon, further, there was a further uproar when a drone was spotted over Kiev, and there was uncertainty as to whether that was a Russian sort of response in kind. It turns out that's not the case, but I set that out just to explain the background. So I'll begin just by looking at some of the details on the strikes on these oil depots. And because there have been many, rather than looking at them individually, if you have a look in the nest, some people have begun to put together summaries of what's happened. And so Kyle Glenn put one together where he's color-coded the dots on the map, and he's also noted the dates. And so that's helpful. I suspect that some have suggested this is the beginning of shaping operations to undermine Russian logistics prior to a Ukrainian offensive. If that's the case, the expectation is that these sorts of attacks will continue. And so these mapped summaries are the basis, because I suspect there will be many more to add. So there's the one by Kyle Glenn, first in the nest. And then if you look at the second, it's by Benjamin Petit, who is a well-known mapper. And he has included not just strikes on oil depots or tanks, but also derailments of trains, because there were 2 derailments of fuel trains in sort of pretty short order in the Bryansk region. The third item in the nest is a tweet by Brady Afric, just demonstrating the efforts people are undertaking to do battle damage assessments, which is difficult. So when these depots are struck, the fires are often very dramatic with massive smoke clouds. I think we've all seen the iconic picture. But often, while the fires can't be put out because of the flammability of the fuel, all that can be done is for adjacent tanks to be, in an attempt to keep them cool by spraying them down with water. And in the case of the first strike against Sevastopol, it appears that only 3, possibly 4 of the tanks, and I don't recall the exact number, I think there are 12 or 14, but only 3 or 4 of them appear to have actually been destroyed, which is just to highlight that, they can be incredibly dramatic initially, but it's not like the entire facility is destroyed in one strike. And so some of these oil depots have actually been struck multiple times. And so the Sevastopol depot, where 3 of 12 or 14 tanks were destroyed, strikes me it's entirely possible may be struck again. To that end, the fourth item in the nest, this is Phillips O'Brien, who's a military researcher. He's asking the question, but I've seen several others, including Friends of the Space, ask, is anybody tracking the cumulative storage capacity that has been destroyed? And so while people are mapping it,
Michael, I think your mic blew again.
Or maybe you're just on mute. So I'll talk about that Phillips O'Brien tweet because I found it and I thought it was really, really interesting. Well, there are people who are mapping out everything. People are starting to wonder, okay, so what exactly is the capacity of, and what fuel was it that was actually being blown up or burned in these fires? And so if you scroll down in that thread, you'll actually find a whole bunch of people who have replied to that. Russian Bridges is in there and has a lot of information. There's a couple of others that have gone through and started to kind of talk about how much fuel could have been lost and what the implications of that would actually be, which is kind of the larger point. Is the capacity is one thing, what the actual fuel is another thing, but what that fuel was used for, was it either for the Navy or for commercial ships going out of those ports, is the bigger picture that people are trying to get to. And I think you're back, Michael.
I am sorry about that. Again, that was an emulator hiccup. Thanks for picking up for me. The last point in sort of this set of attacks on the depots is the fifth item back in the nest. It's the tweet by Will Vernon of the BBC, who was noting that it's not merely the drone strikes against storage depots, but that, again, there were the 2 derailments of trains, and then there was also sabotage against a large electrical pylon as well. So it seems like there's both drone activity, but also partisan attacks taking place, which is an important point to keep in mind. I'll move on to the drone attacks in Moscow and Kiev. So I'll put these up. So the first item that will go up in just a moment is an overview of what happened. It's just the basics that were put together by GeoConfirmed. They did a terrific job of, what happened when. There were, of course, 2 drones that exploded. The attacks, local time in Russia, were at something like 2:17 and 2:40, so they were something like 15 minutes apart. But for whatever reason, the Russians chose not to report on them for something like 12 hours, despite the fact that there were many people who took footage of the explosions. And so those items should be populating in the nest now. While that's happening, Schizo, go ahead.
Yes, a great account to follow if you haven't. I don't know if you had already put one of his tweets in the nest. I did put one of his threads in on Sevastopol. Is RBGB. His Twitter handle is Brucken Ruski. He's done a lot of mapping. You might know him from last year in the early days of the conflict. I think he had a Twitter account like Ukrainian Grain or something like that. He's done a crap ton of mapping, sorry the language, of like every conceivable facility within Russia, whether it's oil terminals or electrical stations, you name it. He's mapped it and puts out really good threads on various events.
Yeah, that's a great point. He's very focused on infrastructure, electrical, fuel, and so on. And so he did a good job looking at the battle damage assessment of that first strike by Sevastopol. I'll see if I have that thread handy. It may be in my materials and I just don't remember it. So in any event, the sort of basic explanation as set out by GeoConfirmed is the first item in the nest. The second item I put up there by Mig Greengard, just to set the context, which is, I know we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the drone strikes on the Kremlin, but he makes the good point to keep in mind nobody died in those attacks, and their implications are largely symbolic. And he notes that on the same day that there were missile strikes in Ukraine that killed, I think it was more than 20 people. And he just wants to make the point that it doesn't make sense to focus on the symbolic that, may or may not be material to the war, and let these sort of strikes that are now becoming routine go ignored. And I thought that was an important point to keep in mind. So the third item in the nest was a report from Sam Bendet, who is a extremely close student of developments in drone warfare. And he found on Telegram several reports of people apparently saying they saw low-flying drones. So the suggestion is they came in extremely low, which may have contributed to their ability to, avoid detection by air defense systems. I know that some others in the space have noted that most modern air defense aren't, designed to observe fixed-wing drones just because of their size and speed. And while the Ukrainians have had to adapt to that by use of Gepard and similar systems, Russia has not had that similar pressure, and so they may still have weaker protection against drones, interestingly enough. However, when Sam notes reports of people talking about low-flying drones, I just want to highlight that it seems like in Russia, a little bit of paranoia about drones is taking root. So the fourth item in the nest, there are now reports of people calling into the police about crazy things, like, they're reporting flocks of birds that they think are drones. They're noting lights in the sky that they think are drone lights, and they turn out to be stars. So this sort of, in the World War II, they refer to this as Foo fighters, unidentified flying object fighters. And so it's certainly a thing that will be affecting the Russian population now. However, it is worth talking about attribution. And so denials came out from several sides. The fifth item back is a tweet from Mikhailo Podolyak, who's an advisor to Zelensky's office, who said that no, Ukraine did not carry out these attacks, and he asserted that it was, likely an attack by the Russians themselves. I believe that Zelensky also came out on video saying, no, we didn't carry this out. We don't have enough weapons to use them in this way. We would be using them more productively in the front lines. Similarly, in terms of attribution, the next item back, sixth or seventh tweet by Caitlin Collins, who I believe is with CNN. Apparently, yes, CNN. So Dmitry Peskov, who is the Kremlin spokesman, came out and said that a decision on an attack like this would not be made by Ukraine. It would have been made by the United States. And so Pentagon spokesman Kirby responded and said, no, Mr. Peskov is lying. It's obviously ludicrous. The United States has had nothing to do with this. And I know it's not really necessary to tell the people in the space this, but I think getting all the reactions is a worthwhile exercise. And as I'm scrolling back, thanks very much to Schizo. He did put up the tweet by Russian Bridges Go Boom in terms of analysis of the damage from the attacks. So we have Ukraine denying responsibility. We have the United States denying responsibility as well. So then a lot of people have weighed in with their thoughts on whether the Russians may have carried out the attack. So I'm just putting up a few angles on that subject, which will populate in just a moment. The first of which is Dmitry Alperovich, who is noting that it took Russia more than 12 hours, apparently, to come out and announce that the attacks had taken place, and saying if the Russians had carried out the attacks, why would they wait 12 hours? That doesn't seem to make very much sense. The second opinion comes from an extremely well-known Russian reporter, the account here on Twitter, Albats, who said that it was not a false flag in her opinion because the Kremlin cannot allow such a humiliation. and that, if a false flag were to be carried out, it would be somewhere with more sort of practical value, like a power plant or an airport. And that, in her opinion, as a longtime political analyst in Russia, that this is a PR disaster for Putin and that he is unable to protect the skies of his own capital. The next item back, tweet by Dmitry of War Translated, on some of the reactions from Russian propagandists. And it's interesting that several of them came out almost immediately with embarrassment and said, where has all the money gone that was spent on state security? That, essentially he's asking the question, popular on Twitter, which is, what air defense doing? So it seems like responses aren't very positive in Russia. However, others have pointed out that, so it's the fourth item back, tweet by Samuel Skov, that, Ukraine has launched similar looking drones in the past and gotten fairly near to Russia, including in February of this year. So it might not be outrageous to think it's possible that Ukraine was involved. And so, for example, then Shashank Joshi, the defense editor at The Economist, came out and, in response to people almost immediately saying it was a false flag, to say, I don't know why people can't accept that it's possible that Ukraine may have been involved, because it's clear that they have expressed a desire to do this. There was conversation about the fact that Ukraine, said in media that they were planning a large-scale drone attack around the February 24th anniversary of the full-scale invasion, but that they called that off for various purposes. And so there is a link to the Washington Post article where those comments were made. And then sort of I think it's maybe the final thought on attribution, from Neil Hauer saying, well, why would Russia want to carry out a false flag? Even in launching the invasion in the first place, they didn't really invest anything into trying to justify it via false flag. So if they wanted to take this action, if they wanted to take any particular action, whether it be a domestic crackdown or whether it be some form of retaliatory response or interruption of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, they probably don't need pretext to do it. And so again, it's all reading tea leaves, but again, that leaves us with, on hard evidence, we don't really have any. The Ukrainians are denying it. The Russians are denying it. The Americans are saying they didn't have advance notice of it. They certainly weren't involved. And so there's a vacuum. And into that, there are now partisan groups who are starting to claim responsibility. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But I think Exit put her hand up, so we'll go to Exit first and then Jane.
Nope, I was going to ask because I thought I had seen something about partisan groups, but I didn't have a chance to read it this afternoon because of work. So I will wait and be patient.
Well, so perhaps while we hear from Jane, I know that Intel Schizo had written his thoughts on the claim from the partisan groups, so maybe he can put that up and speak to that. But in the meantime, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, oops. Sorry. It's an interesting thing to me that at least all of the players that in theory could be involved in this, and this could be a third-party actor. I heard Alexander Vindman surprisingly say that in his mind, this was likely a group somewhere in Ukraine, unnamed special operations troops not operating under the ownership of the Ukrainian government. And that surprised me like crazy that he said that, because he's normally so careful about attributing things to anybody. But the fact that everyone's running from it, almost strikes me like, well, there's obviously a guilty party out here. And the question is, I think if you look at this analytically, who has the most to gain from this? And I don't know if anybody else has done this or has better capabilities than I do. I've looked over the video of this with some photo software several times, and it just seems like whatever is burning awfully hot to be a last-minute launch from the top of the Kremlin or wherever they had the batteries of missiles that they were firing from. But that is not, if it's a missile, it was not a big warhead. And if that's just a couple pounds of blow-up, boy, that is some hot stuff. If you look at the color of the explosion, for that to be just an average, missile, and I'm just wondering, there's something about this that does not work for me. That doesn't work, and I could be way off base, but there's something about the way that those drones came in from behind the Kremlin. I got nowhere near the middle of the building, albeit who knows where Putin's residence is, although Putin's residence is at his dacha. And so it wouldn't have been too smart to hit the Kremlin. And I'm just curious to know if anybody has some thoughts where it would make sense. Who's the player that wins from this? Beyond it being a real stretch to get to the false flag matter, and while Victory Day is next week, and Putin's got problems with his industrial base organizations where he was threatening factory managers unless they start massively upgunning their output. Last week, there's a lot that in Russia that is just going wrong. It seems like every time he tries to up the ante, whatever it is, doesn't work. And it just gets worse and worse for him. And while there's an awful lot that points to Russia, I don't know. This is such this is going to be a conundrum until, if it is ever figured out in the open, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But I'm curious to know if anybody has thoughts about the explosion itself. Thanks.
Well, I don't know if he has thoughts on the explosion itself. We may get to that in a moment, but I expect that Schizo may have some thoughts on responsibility. He has put up his tweet regarding the claim of the partisan group. Schizo, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this afternoon we did get, to my knowledge, the first official claim from anybody. At first it was reported as being a Russian anarchist group, but I decided to go digging through their Telegram channel. They are in fact a Ukrainian anarchist group. But the claim to me, the reason why I think that their claim is pretty rubbish is how vague they were bragging about it, like in terms of claiming responsibility. So they pretty much referred to a post that they had made in their own server back in July of last year, asking for donations so that they could throw, quote, sparklers at the walls of the Kremlin. And then they just pretty much posted the video of the drone hitting the Kremlin, was like, we promised, we did it. That doesn't seem very, like a very strong claim. So to me, this claim that's come out of this Ukrainian anarchist group just seems to be taking advantage of the lack of anybody coming forward in claiming responsibility. So I don't think they did it. There's a lot of higher profile people that also Don't really think it was Ukraine. I was in Mario Narwhal's space yesterday, and we actually had the former Minister of Infrastructure of Ukraine in there. He was asked about it. He believes it was a Russian partisan group, and I'm spacing the name, but he mentioned that a former member of the Duma in Russia had also came out and said that it was a partisan anti-Putin group. There is one that I do think, if it is a Russian partisan group, this afternoon there was a drone strike in Russia. Gotta make sure I have the name of the facility right. Oh, sorry, it was yesterday. So that was in the Bryansk that destroyed a AN-124-100. So like those giant, massive cargo planes. There's one currently sitting in Canada. So yesterday, one of these planes was blown up at their storage facility, and that was a group in Russia called the Freedom of Russia Legion claim responsibility for that. They've had a history of doing drone attacks within Russia, but they haven't claimed responsibility for the Kremlin. But just kind of looking at this Freedom of Russia Legion, they seem to like throwing drones and stuff. So I'd say that they're potentially more likely. I did post in the Nest too the drone that has been preliminarily identified. We talked about this in the Bauma report last night. The drone appears to be a Mugen 5 Pro, which is pretty much a Alibaba drone that you can buy for like $10,000. So half the price of a Shahed drone. Both sides have used the drone, but it's been more predominantly seen within Russia being utilized on strikes in Ukraine. But Ukraine does have history using it. We talked pretty in depth with Portland about the specs of this drone, and I made a thread about it. Mathematically, it's possible that the drone could have been launched from Ukraine. So in theory, if you do under ideal conditions, the math adds up that it could possibly have come from Ukraine. But then you get into like, that's under ideal conditions. You have had the right fuel mixture, right speed, perfect wind the entire time. 2 minutes, like a lot of variables where it's like, I kind of doubt that. And then you have the air defense factor the way in as well. This is a pretty decent sized drone, 16-foot wingspan by 11 feet long. So about 3/4 the size of a TB2 drone, which has a pretty decent history of being detected and shot down. So in terms of the claim that if it was a strike from Ukraine, I don't see the likelihood of how this thing could have flown for 5 hours in Russian airspace undetected. It's also a VTOL drone, so vertical takeoff and landing, like a lot of the quadcopter drones that are out there. So it seems more likely that it was launched. This was actually a Miri report. They had some great discussion about it earlier today, that the drone was likely launched pretty close to the Kremlin, say like within a 10-15 minute flight radius, because once you take off, you want to make sure that the connection's stable and everything's good to go. But yeah, back to the groups though, there's only one group that's actually come forward at this point, and that's that anarchist group in Ukraine. I highly doubt it's them. Their claim's super weak. And when you look at what they typically have been up to, they've been active in some of the heaviest fighting throughout the past year, fighting with territorial defense units, currently engaged in Bakhmut. So I highly doubt that they stopped fighting in Bakhmut to go fly a drone for 5 hours into Russian airspace, let alone, I don't see how they could have slipped some dudes from Bakhmut to Moscow and then find a way to smuggle the drone undetected you know, ends up. I highly doubt it's them. I think they're just taking advantage of the fact that nobody's come forward saying that they did it.
I wouldn't be surprised if several others make claims. If I'm not mistaken, when Dugina was killed and then when Tatarsky was killed, there were, I think, in both those cases, more than one claim, none of which could be very well backed up. You know, to the question of who did it, one joke I saw that I appreciated was the suggestion, in the absence of evidence of any individual, it still remains possible that the murder on the Orient Express scenario is a possible explanation, meaning that all of them did it, just in different ways. But I think it was Daniel and then Radio. Go ahead, Daniel.
Good morning. I will express my opinion without proof, but I think something is more probable than anything else. I will try to be short, but it's something interesting. 2 days ago, I said Ukraine have all the requirements for such an attack. We have a great example. In fact, two. First is a strike at Ensk. Second was yesterday, in 500 kilometers away from front line, deep in Russia, another refinery. So the possibility is there. What is not happened, no hush-hush word, no blinking, no everyone, I mean from the civilian society, political leaders, to army leaders, everyone declined responsibility very, very determined. I will not put a lot of confidence when Ukraine denies something, but in my opinion, they have nothing to get. Also, Reznikov given interview, which I read it on Yahoo. He said Ukraine not just deals with United States against any strike in Russia with American technology, but they sign a contract. They assume like a party. They will never do this. So when you hear Olaf Scholz, try to imagine he is right. I know, it's unbelievable. Second is Kremlin. Kremlin did two things which are extremely weird. From the publishing 12 hours later to jumping, accusing Washington. First is a very, very bad image for Vladimir Putin. That's blowing something in the front of the flagpole above the dome of the Senate. Senate in Russia has no political meaning. In fact, it's a Federation Council name, but is high symbolic. My conclusion comes from two places. First is Strelkov. Everybody loves a nice war criminal, which is calling, like many others, including Prigozhin, for traitors, inside traitors. Usually the attacks are directed to Defense Ministry, Shoigu and Gerasimov. But the hunt for traitors is real, and I can say is wild. I think people forget about a total killing of Direction 5 of FSB. And I think people forget also, at middle of February 2022, all the detailed images, plans, map of the invasion coming from USA and published in all media channels, which tells me something like this. Is a big faction inside, political, FSB, army, we can call it general Silovikis of the old age, who are somehow a bit more rational, understanding the road is bad, extremely bad, and they're acting. I have only one source which directs us there. The connection of FSB, GRU, Ukraine, and probably American Secret Service. And people didn't watch closely what happened. The release of Azovstal defenders, the first release. Everybody was stunned. You know, you get the main political opponent of Ukrainian President Zelensky in exchange for 5 leaders of Azov battalion and a lot of warriors. This negotiation was made with Saudi Prince, Turkey, and some small actors which are in Rada, in Ukrainian parliament, which can be considered probably the most pro-Russian or open Russian channels from all. People from Donbass, people who were active in former KGB of Soviet Union, people with, I can say, still having connections with Lugansk People's Republic, Donetsk People's Republic, FSB, and Russian military, including the general who sieged Mariupol. The deal was made with them. In my opinion,
right. So I'm just trying to understand where you're heading with it. Yeah.
Exactly. I go to my conclusion. In my opinion, people imagine is a very cohesive collective around Putin. They are not. And I think the most probable author of this attack, and is one of them, and probably one of the biggest ally of Ukraine in this war, is FSB. Not all, but first, the people from fifth direction, which was responsible for Ukraine, which were sacked, arrested, and people like them. Why put my claim there? First, look at the footage. Footage were hard to be accessed by anyone who has not enough clearance. That surveillance is made by secret services.
So I'm sorry, are you referring to the footage of the attack on the Kremlin itself?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Because my assumption would be that it was caught on so many cameras that it just couldn't be kept secret at all.
Yeah, but was it purged?
Hmm?
Can be purged and cannot be released because that is not a public area. That's the area, you see, is not under control of Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow. It's under control of SFO, Secret Service for Protection of the President. Is from the 27th April. Yeah.
So So we, I'm not going to argue with you in that you're putting forward a theory. It strikes me that it's circumstantial, and that's fine until we can get more definite proof. It would just remain among the possibilities. But I respect you raising the idea that it could be essentially Russian partisans who were connected with the state. It's just how we would ever confirm that is really the challenge. So, I think I think we've heard your point. Okay. We'll go to radio, and then we'll see what we're doing for time. Go ahead, radio.
Yeah, I'll be real quick. I just wanted to speak to two things about the drone. One, the explosion. I think you'll find that it was likely a low-order explosion. Most of the drone explosions we've seen have been high explosives, which detonate, extremely fastly, like 6 kilometers per second. This looks to me, and the fact that it was in multiple frames of the image, more like a pipe bomb, flash powder, gunpowder, black powder, whatever you want to call it, a low-order explosion, more like fireworks than TNT. As for the drone itself, I would strongly think that in order to hit something like that in such a GNSS denied environment, there's jamming of all of the navigation signals all over Moscow and have been for years at this point, that somebody would either have to be eyes on the target or quite close and it up in a fairly high location to steer it to the target using the the data link to the remote, so you can see the video of the drone and guide it there, because the amount of jamming in the Moscow area, the amount of RF they're putting in the air is just extremely immense right now, especially after this. But even before, they were jamming everything. So that was just my point on that. And you probably want to talk to an explosives expert on the first point, but it just looks low order to me versus high order. And that may explain why it looks different. That's all I had.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. And your point about if it was manually guided in, having line of sight is a good point. Okay, I'm going to run through just a couple last points in connection with the drones. Unfortunately, there's a bunch of other material that I prepared. We often don't get to cover it all, including some of the increased activity in the North Sea, some developments with political prisoners, and developments with the Russian opposition coming together to put out a unified statement, or a largely unified statement. But I would encourage you to look at my agenda if you'd like to see all of that background, updates. You've probably seen most of it, but just there might be elements you've missed. In any event, I'll kick a few of them forward to Sundays. So just a reminder that our next conversation will be on Sunday. So I do imagine we'll wrap up in about 10 minutes. Just for my co-hosts, we're not going to run too long. And exit, if you wanted to put up a reminder about your ongoing geolocation puzzle that we'll have answers for on Sunday. If you prep that, then we'll point it out to people before we wrap. So running through the last points on the drone attacks, I wanted to note, so the first item in the nest is the graphic suggesting that Ukrainian Postal Service should be putting out another stamp, just as they did for the sinking of the Moskva. And so I found that one amusing. You guys might enjoy the graphic. In terms of consequences, despite the attacks, the Kremlin has still come out and said that they intend to hold their parade on May the 9th. I've seen a bunch of reports that the parade is greatly scaled back. Apparently, they haven't begun practicing where they normally would have at this point. Specifically, no aircraft practice. They didn't have any aircraft last year. It's believed that they may not have any tanks attending this year either, which could potentially be embarrassing. In any event, the fact that they're carrying on the parade at all is a little bit surprising, since some in Ukraine have suggested that an attempt may be made to get a drone to the parade grounds as well, just as another symbolic strike. But anyway, they intend to go ahead with it. To that end, third item back in the nest, interestingly, Russia has banned the use of drones in several regions now. and not just around Moscow, but I don't understand why some regions are included and some are not. I just haven't had time to dig into it, but that may interest you. There is a map in that third tweet back in the nest from Sam about which regions have bans in place and which don't. Fourth item is just to mention the scare this afternoon that Russian drones may have similarly made it over Kiev, but there was confirmation from the Ukrainians that it was in fact a TB2. The last I heard, which was 6 hours ago at this point, was that it was a TB2 being used south of the city that apparently they lost communication with, and it sort of went off track. The assumption is that it wasn't immediately taken down because they were hoping to regain control of it. But the suggestion is that as it wandered closer to the city proper, that electronic warfare defenses may have affected it so that it moved more erratically and made it even more difficult for it to be taken under control again, which is why they shot it down. Not that it was necessarily a mistake, but that it was certainly out of control, and perhaps they thought it was too much of a danger over the city. But in any event, it was not a Russian response. Last points, and these are really thought-provoking ones. We probably don't have time to discuss them in the way I thought we might, but the fifth and sixth items back. So the fifth is by Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist, asking, he wonders why Russia hasn't conducted more missile attacks against Ukrainian political leadership. And he puts out a couple of possibilities as to why he thinks that may be, including they've tried it, but that jamming has defended. That number two, perhaps Russia has just prioritized use of missiles against other targets. And it wasn't, attempting to target political leadership wasn't worth the resources. Or number three, concerns regarding escalation. And so I just want to put that out there as thought-provoking. You can always go to that thread and engage. There are a whole lot of thoughtful, well-known accounts who have responded there, making points about his suggestions about, was it jamming? Was it lack of will? Was it escalation? Don't make sense, in that if Russia had really wanted to, jamming would not be a problem. They could use ballistic missiles. So people are working through the possibilities there. So I thought it was an interesting thread. Finally, just with regard to the drone strikes, putting up as thought-provoking, it's a tweet by Nathan Ruser. It's now like the 7th or 8th tweet back in the nest, where the Institute for the Study of War, in their update yesterday, came out and said they assume, or I believe they said that it's likely that the strike on the Kremlin was conducted by the Russians themselves. And so Nathan, who is a military analyst, has come out and said he thinks that that is a problem, and that just because the Institute for the Study of War has been diligent in its mapping efforts, that they've developed a big following and respect, but that their expertise is not in parsing political implications. And that in this case, there doesn't appear to be, people are free to make assumptions, but the closer you are, it's sort of like the divide in a newspaper between hard news reporting and an editorial page or, commentary. And he's suggesting that there isn't enough evidence in this case that it was appropriate for the Institute for the Study of War to sort of mix into their hard news reporting assumptions about it being likely that Russia carried out the attack. There just isn't enough to push it one way or the other. And there's been a lot of back and forth between the various analyst accounts. For example, Michael Kaufman came out and said this was fair, constructive criticism. And then Phillips O'Brien came out and said he found it amusing that people were suggesting they shouldn't be allowed to speculate. So anyway, I put it out there to the extent that you yourselves put out any reports. Where does that line exist where you decide there's enough evidence to include a speculative call versus just stay completely silent or say there's insufficient evidence? In any event, I think that's all we're going to have time for, as we've gone a little bit over. Exit, you had put up the puzzle. Did you want to speak to that? And I think you had one or two other points you wanted to mention.
I've got 4. So yes, up in the nest, first one up in the nest right now, you will see the geolocation puzzle from last Sunday. And there is an easy version, a hard version, and a bonus at the bottom. Hopefully you enjoy that. I know that some of the people who have tried have really enjoyed it, and some people have even traveled there, which is really interesting to me. And then second back, you will find a post from GeoConfirmed. If you've already done the Geo puzzle, I would encourage you to try your hand at geolocating something in the real world that actually has consequences for it. When I was talking to some of the people from GeoConfirmed, they said they really want to have people try out geolocating things. Typically, when they have newer people start, they suggest starting with something that's like maybe 2 days old. If you find an event that's 2 days old and it's not already on their map, it's probably less time pressure, but that also means that it's still a valuable thing to geolocate. And you can kind of take your time and make sure that you actually get the information correct. And so that post will tell you how to tag them in your post and how to frame your geolocation and put that information out there. So I would encourage you to try that, because ultimately that's kind of the whole point of what we're trying to do here. And then the last 2 posts are from Peter Curzon, who's a friend of the space. He put up some information about, obviously, Sudan is a massive issue right now with some major conflict happening. And he put up a post earlier today that's kind of just a clip from one of his conversations about Sudan. I would encourage you to go listen to it. And then he also has a space on tomorrow at 8 a.m. my time, so that'll be 10 New York time. And it is with the director of Turkey for the Middle East Institute this Friday. And so if you are interested in the Turkey elections, interested in what's going on there, I would encourage you to set your reminder and go listen to that.
Thanks for running through all those. We often wind up with a whole bunch of promos at the end. So if they're friends of the space, we're happy to direct people to them, because they're usually great content. So I'll just conclude by reminding everybody that we'll be holding our next discussion on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time or New York time. Our likely topics will be a discussion of the implications of the Turkish election, and I'll also dig a little bit into timing and implications of the celebrations for May 9th in Russia, as that will be coming up, I think, just on Tuesday. And I hope that we can see you all there. So feel free to set your reminder. The invite for that is the first item in the nest. So I think we had a great conversation. Once again, thanks to John Conrad as our guest, discussing shipping and naval matters. And thanks to my ham radio friends, Paul, ID10T, and Radio and Nukes, for running through sort of the intro to that. I appreciate everybody who came up to speak. I think they're all good accounts. I'd encourage you to check out their profiles and give them a follow. And finally, thanks to Intel Schizo and to Exit for co-hosting for me. Without your help, it would be extremely hard to run these spaces. So I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday afternoon. Have a good night.